Hey guys, today we embark on a journey, not through distant galaxies or forgotten empires, but into the very substance that makes your morning coffee sing and your birthday cake a beacon of joy. Imagine, if you will, the gentle caress of a sugar crystal dissolving on your tongue, the instant rush, the pure, unadulterated bliss. You probably don't think much about that innocent sweetness, do you? You probably just assume it's always been there, always so readily available. Well, let me tell you, this story, while seemingly sweet, has more twists and turns than a labyrinth made of licorice. And honestly, if you're not careful, you might just drown in the sheer historical density of it all. But fear not, we're going to wade through it together, one delicious, sometimes dark step at a time. Ancient sweeteners. Early humans sought sweetness from honey and fruits, a primal craving. You stand on the edge of a primeval forest, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and unseen blossoms. Your stomach rumbles, a dull, familiar ache. You're not looking for a quick drive-through or even a quaint little bistro. You're driven by something far more fundamental, the desperate, innate craving for energy. And what better source than the sticky, golden elixir dripping from a wild beehive nestled high in a gnarled oak? This isn't just a treat, it's survival. For tens of thousands of years, before the first grain was sown or the first animal truly domesticated, you, our ancient ancestor, understood sweetness intimately through honey and the ripe bounty of the forest. Imagine the sheer audacity, the raw courage it took to pry that honey from the grasp of a furious swarm. You climb, perhaps with rudimentary tools, smoke to calm the buzzing guardians, your fingers already tingling with the promise of pain. This isn't just a snack, it's a conquest. Historians still debate whether the earliest humans simply scavenged fallen hives or actively developed ingenious and terrifying methods to extract the precious liquid directly. Evidence from rock art, like the famous scene in Spain's spider caves of Bicorp, depicts figures scaling cliffs, surrounded by bees reaching for hives. It's a stark reminder that your morning spoonful of honey didn't just magically appear. Someone, somewhere, endured a lot of stings for it. Imagine trying to explain to your caveman buddies that you spent all afternoon getting stung by 1,000 tiny, angry dentists just for a spoonful of goo. They'd probably just point at the nearest antelope and ask why you didn't just eat that. Less pain, more protein. Beyond the bees' bounty, there were fruits. Oh, the fruits. Wild berries, plump and bursting with juice. Figs so lusciously sweet they almost made you forget the daily grind of survival. Dates clinging to palm trees in sun-drenched oases. You'd learn the cycles of the seasons, memorizing which trees bore fruit when, which berries wouldn't send you into a convulsion, and which would actually provide a much-needed energy boost. It was a gamble, of course. Not every bright red berry was a friend. Some were decidedly less friendly, promising a quick trip to the digestive discomfort dimension. But the rewards, the sheer delight of biting into a perfectly ripe mango or a cluster of wild grapes, must have been intoxicating. Back then, if you wanted a banana, you didn't just pop to the supermarket. You probably had to wrestle a baboon for it, and frankly, the baboon usually won. This primal craving wasn't just about taste, it was about efficiency. Sweetness often signals high caloric content. A quick burst of energy vital for hunter-gatherers constantly on the move, constantly expending enormous amounts of physical effort. Your body, even now, carries this ancient programming, this deeply ingrained desire for sugar, because for most of human history, sugar meant survival. It meant the difference between making it through the lean winter months and, well, not making it. You didn't have refined sugars, obviously. No crystalline cubes, no powdered bliss. Your sweetness was raw, unadulterated, tied directly to the earth and its cycles. Honey, with its complex floral notes and varying consistencies, was probably the closest thing to a concentrated sweetener. It was also, quite literally, a golden commodity, used not just for food but for ancient medicines, as a preservative, and even in some early rituals. Think about that next time you drizzle it over your yogurt. You're tapping into a tradition that stretches back further than any written language, any great pyramid. If an ancient human saw your pantry today, overflowing with cookies, candies, and sugary cereals, they'd probably think you were either a god, or perhaps just preparing for an apocalypse, or maybe even just a really, really intense dessert party. They'd certainly be bewildered by the sheer accessibility of something they had to risk life and limb for. It's almost enough to make you feel a little guilty about that extra scoop of ice cream, isn't it? Almost. The human palate, you see, evolved to seek out these energy-dense foods. Those who had a knack for finding the sweetest fruits, the richest honeycombs, were more likely to thrive, to reproduce, to pass on those very genes that encoded a sweet tooth. So in a way, your current craving for that chocolate bar isn't a weakness. It's an evolutionary triumph, a whisper from your ancient ancestors saying, "Get that energy while you can." Except, of course, they didn't have the downside of endless supply and sedentary lifestyles. For them, it was a finite, hard-won reward. And as we'll soon discover, that hard-won reward would, in time, become the foundation for empires, for fortunes, and for suffering on a scale almost unimaginable to those early foragers simply looking for a sweet escape from hunger. India's cane discovery. Sugar cane originated in New Guinea, later cultivated in ancient India. You find yourself standing, or perhaps gently floating, in the humid embrace of a dense, ancient jungle. The air hangs thick with the scent of damp earth and exotic blossoms, a symphony of buzzing insects and unseen creatures rustling through the undergrowth. Sunlight, fractured and green, dapples the forest floor, illuminating a landscape that feels both primal and alive. You crane your neck, tracing the vertical lines of what seems like an impossibly tall grass, its segmented stalks reaching for the sky, their tips adorned with feathery plumes. This is it. This is sugarcane in its ancestral home, New Guinea. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated curiosity of those first humans who stumbled upon this seemingly innocuous plant. After eons of scrounging for honey in beehives, often at the risk of some rather grumpy bee stings, or plucking sweet fruits from precarious branches, here was a new, abundant source. You might cautiously snap off a segment, perhaps using a sharp stone, and bring it to your mouth. The initial fibrous resistance gives way to a rush of pure, unadulterated liquid sweetness, a clean, vegetal syrup that floods your senses. It's a moment of pure, unadulterated delight, a primal craving satisfied in the most unexpected way. This isn't just a snack, it's a revelation. And if you think harvesting it was easy back then, you'd be right. It wasn't. No, really, if you were relying on your bare hands and a prayer, you probably wouldn't survive this arduous, machete-less endeavor. You'd likely end up with more splinters than sugar, and a profound respect for ancient agriculturalists. From the lush, wild heart of New Guinea, a place so remote even today it feels like a secret garden, this remarkable grass began its slow, deliberate migration. It didn't have wings, of course, nor little sugar-powered legs. Instead, it traveled on the currents of human ingenuity and curiosity. Over millennia, it journeyed westward, carried by intrepid seafarers and migrating tribes, making its way across the vast Indonesian archipelago, through the islands of Southeast Asia, until finally it reached the fertile plains and river valleys of ancient India. This wasn't a sudden invasion, but a gradual organic integration into diverse ecosystems, and more importantly, diverse cultures. It was here, in ancient India, likely somewhere between 500 and 300 BCE, that something truly transformative happened. The sweet, juicy cane, once merely chewed for its raw nectar, was subjected to human innovation. You see, while delicious, simply chewing cane yields only so much. The challenge was preservation, concentration, and transport. And so, Indian alchemists, or perhaps just particularly observant cooks, began to experiment. They discovered that by crushing the stalks, using what were likely rudimentary presses, perhaps giant stones rolled over the cane by oxen, or even just brute human force, they could extract the juice. Then, through a process of slow, careful boiling, a thick syrup would emerge. As the water evaporated, the liquid would darken, thicken further, and eventually, magically, crystallize. This wasn't just syrup, this was granular sugar. The word sugar itself, or sakar, as you might hear it, finds its roots in the Sanskrit sharkara, meaning gravel or grit, a delightful nod to its newfound granular form. This, my friend, is your mainstream historical fact. The ancient Indians were the first to develop methods for crystallizing sugar, transforming a perishable juice into a portable, storable commodity. Imagine the scene. The earthy smell of boiling juice mingling with the tropical air, the rhythmic creak of the presses, the slow, mesmerizing process of the liquid thickening in vast, shallow pans. It was a laborious process, no doubt, but the reward, a sparkling, amber-hued treasure that could be stored, traded, and enjoyed long after the harvest. You could sprinkle it on your morning porridge, or perhaps, for a truly wild experience, mix it with a bit of spice for an ancient Indian candy bar. Definitely better than crocodile dung sunscreen, remember that little gem. Though I hear some folks back then used it as medicine, claiming it cured everything from bad breath to, well, you get the idea. A truly quirky tidbit, wouldn't you say? Sugar, in its early days, was often viewed more as a pharmaceutical marvel than a culinary delight. A spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. Indeed, especially when the sugar was the medicine. Historians still argue whether the crystallization process was a sudden stroke of genius or a gradual evolution over centuries, passed down through generations of rural communities. The exact timeline of its earliest widespread use for culinary purposes also remains a topic of spirited debate among scholars. What is clear, however, is that this Indian innovation marked a pivotal moment in the history of sweetness. It transformed sugar from a fleeting pleasure found in nature into a product, a commodity, something that could travel and endure. And travel it did, quietly, slowly, like a sweet, persistent rumor, preparing itself for an eventual journey that would change the world, for better and for worse. For now, though, you can almost taste the warm, earthy sweetness of that first granulated sugar, a testament to ancient ingenuity and a universal desire for that pure, undiluted joy of sweetness. You're standing in a bustling marketplace, the air thick with the scent of spices, the murmur of 100 tongues, the clatter of goods being unloaded from donkey carts. It's a sensory overload, a kaleidoscope of ancient life unfolding before you, a vibrant tapestry woven from threads of commerce and culture. And if you were actually here, breathing in this ancient dust, doing this back then, let's be honest, you'd probably be dead from dysentery or some other charming, historically common ailment by now. But this isn't just any market. This is a crossroads, a vital artery of the ancient world, a place where knowledge travels as fast as goods, and sometimes even faster. And among those goods, slowly but surely, is something revolutionary: sugar. From India, where we left off with its initial, rather humble cultivation, the knowledge of how to extract that crystalline sweetness began its journey. You can almost hear the rustle of silk and the rhythmic clatter of pottery as it made its way along ancient trade routes, carried by merchants, scholars, and sometimes even by the movement of armies. The Indians, bless their sweet hearts, had already figured out how to boil down the cane juice into a solid, unrefined mass they called gur or jaggery. Think of it as the original unpasteurized, unhomogenized, artisanal sugar block, perfectly functional, but a bit rustic. But then, you see, the Persians entered the scene. And the Sasanian Empire, flourishing between the 3rd and 7th centuries AD, played a truly pivotal role in sugar's westward journey. They weren't just content to be mere intermediaries. They were innovators, taking what they learned from India and refining it. They were meticulous, these Persians. They weren't satisfied with just a sticky lump. Oh no. They developed more efficient methods for purifying the raw sugar, leading to a product that was whiter, finer, and therefore infinitely more desirable. This wasn't just about taste anymore. It was about status. The whiter the sugar, the more refined the process, the more prestige it conveyed. It was the ancient equivalent of owning a limited edition, custom-built supercar, except this supercar was edible and made you jittery. Imagine yourself in one of their sugar houses, a place that honestly would be far less glamorous than it sounds. It would be hot, humid, and filled with the intense, almost cloying, sweet smell of boiling cane juice, mingling with the acrid scent of various clarifying agents, perhaps even some clay or ash, which were used to draw out impurities. You'd probably see massive copper kettles, bubbling away, tended by laborers who, let's be honest, wouldn't have been too thrilled with their job description. Their task was to boil the cane juice down, carefully skimming off impurities that rose to the surface, a bit like trying to clean pond scum, but with the added peril of scalding steam and intense heat. Then they'd let the concentrated syrup crystallize into what was known as sugar candy or refined blocks. This wasn't just about making sugar. It was about making cleaner sugar, a more visually appealing and palatable product. Your ancient Persian sugar maker, their hands perpetually sticky, would probably struggle with high fives for the rest of their days, making every celebratory moment slightly awkward. Did you know that early Persian physicians sometimes prescribed sugar as a remedy for various ailments? It was often mixed with other, sometimes less palatable, ingredients. Imagine a spoonful of sugar helping that particular medicine go down. If the medicine wasn't, say, pulverized goat horn or a particularly pungent herb. It speaks to the early recognition of sugar's unique properties, even if its medicinal efficacy was questionable at best. This refining process was absolutely key. It transformed sugar from a bulky, somewhat crude commodity into a more portable and stable one. This, in turn, significantly increased its value and made it far easier to transport across vast distances. The Persians, strategically located at the crossroads of East and West, became the primary conduits for this sweet knowledge. They weren't just passing on a product. They were spreading an entire industry, a whole new way of thinking about sweetness. Think of them as the original tech disruptors, but with sugarcane instead of Silicon Valley startups. Their influence was profound. As the Sasanian Empire expanded its reach, so too did the cultivation of sugarcane and, crucially, the sophisticated techniques for processing it. They introduced it to Mesopotamia, that fertile crescent of agricultural innovation we talked about, where ancient civilizations had already mastered irrigation and crop rotation. From there, the sugar knowledge began its slow, inevitable march westwards, like a very slow, very sweet, and incredibly persistent wave, subtly changing palates and economies as it went. One could argue that without this systematic Persian refinement and methodical spread, sugar might have remained an obscure Indian curiosity for much longer, a localized delicacy. They perfected the art of making sugar easy to handle, easy to transport, and crucially, easy to desire. It stopped being merely a medicinal oddity or a rare spice for the very elite, and started its journey towards becoming a staple, albeit still an incredibly expensive one. You can almost picture ancient Persian chefs, their eyes gleaming with inspiration, excitedly experimenting with this new, potent ingredient, perhaps creating the world's first truly decadent baklava, or inventing some kind of gloriously sticky, sugar-crusted lamb. Don't knock it till you've tried it, apparently, especially after a long day of camel riding. The spread wasn't always smooth sailing, of course. Imagine trying to convince someone in the Mediterranean, accustomed to the comforting, familiar sweetness of honey and sun-dried dates, that this strange, hard crystal was worth the trouble and the expense. It's like honey, but drier and harder to get and more expensive, and it's from Persia. Not exactly a killer sales pitch, is it? Especially when your local beekeeper is right there, offering fresh honeycomb for a fraction of the cost. Yet the inherent human craving for sweetness, that primal urge we touched upon earlier, was a powerful, silent advocate. And the sheer versatility of sugar, its ability to preserve fruits, to add new textures to baked goods, to create entirely new culinary experiences, slowly, irresistibly won people over. Historians still argue whether the Persian dissemination was primarily through military conquest, peaceful trade, or a more organic cultural exchange. It was likely a complex tapestry of all three. Conquerors often brought new crops and technologies with them. Traders facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas, and cultural osmosis meant that successful practices simply diffused across borders. Regardless of the exact mechanism, the impact was undeniable. The sweet secret was out, and it was heading for Europe, though it would take a few more centuries and a few more empires to truly embed itself there. For now, you're watching the early ripples of a sugar-fueled revolution, slowly, steadily, spreading from the heart of Persia. The world was about to get a whole lot sweeter, whether it knew it or not. You're squinting, aren't you? The sun, a brutal, unforgiving orb, hangs low over the endless dunes. Sand, fine as powdered sugar, whips around your ankles, but this isn't the sweet kind, oh no. This is the kind that gets in your teeth, your eyes, and everywhere else you'd rather it didn't. You're trudging alongside a camel train, its beasts laden with goods that smell of far-off land spices you can't name, textiles woven with gold thread, and something else, something intensely, addictively sweet. The air shimmers with heat, but also with anticipation. Because here, in this vast, sun-baked landscape, something truly golden is about to emerge. An empire built not on conquest, but on the delicate, shimmering crystals of sugar. And honestly, if you were actually out here, chasing this sweet dream across the unforgiving desert, you probably wouldn't survive this. Dehydration, bandit raids, a camel with a bad attitude, take your pick. But hey, at least you'd go out knowing what pure, unadulterated sweetness tasted like. The Persians, bless their innovative hearts, had taken India's raw sugar and run with it. But it was the Arab world, specifically the burgeoning Islamic caliphates, who truly elevated sugar from a rare curiosity to an agricultural and culinary cornerstone. Imagine, if you will, the bustling markets of Baghdad, Cairo, or Damascus during the Abbasid Golden Age. The scent of exotic spices, yes, but increasingly, the heady, intoxicating aroma of processed sugar. It was more than just a sweet treat. It was a symbol of sophistication, a medical remedy, and an economic powerhouse. They weren't just trading it, they were growing it. From the fertile plains of Mesopotamia to the sun-drenched fields of Egypt and North Africa, and eventually reaching as far west as Al-Andalus, modern-day Spain. This wasn't some haphazard scattering of seeds. This was a deliberate, large-scale agricultural enterprise, often supported by sophisticated irrigation systems like the qanats, those ingenious underground channels that tapped into groundwater and transported it for miles, minimizing evaporation in the harsh desert climate. Think of them as ancient, incredibly patient aqueducts, but mostly invisible, working tirelessly beneath your feet to bring life and sugar cane to arid lands. It's enough to make you wonder if they also had tiny, underground, sugarcane-themed gift shops. Probably not, but cultivation was only half the battle. The true magic happened in the refineries. The Arabs inherited and refined the methods they learned from the Persians and Indians, taking them to new heights of purity and efficiency. They developed processes for clarifying the dark, molasses-laden raw sugar, often using natural absorbents like clay or ash, followed by repeated boiling and skimming. Then came the crystallization. Instead of the rough, irregular lumps you might get from earlier methods, the Arab refiners perfected techniques to produce finer, whiter, more uniform crystals. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It meant a more stable product, easier to transport and less prone to spoilage. They introduced the sugar loaf, too. Picture tall, conical molds into which the purified, still liquid sugar was poured. As it cooled and crystallized, it formed a solid, easily handled cone of pure white sugar. This was the equivalent of a perfectly packaged, branded product in the medieval world. It was a status symbol. If you had a sugar loaf on your table, you weren't just eating dessert. You were making a statement. It was basically saying, yes, I have disposable income. And yes, my teeth will probably rot out, but oh, what a glorious way to go. Beyond its culinary applications, sugar in the Arab world took on a significant role in medicine. Physicians like Avicenna, the polymath whose canon of medicine was a standard text for centuries, prescribed sugar for a variety of ailments. It wasn't just a sweetener to make bitter medicines palatable. It was believed to have medicinal properties of its own. It was used as a preservative in tinctures and syrups, a way to make remedies last longer, and even applied topically to wounds, perhaps for its antimicrobial properties, though they wouldn't have understood the science behind that. Imagine being told, here, take this spoonful of sugar. It's for your fever. No, really. It sounds like something a well-meaning but slightly unhinged grandmother might suggest, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for the widespread adoption and expansion of sugar cultivation by the Arab caliphates was purely economic, driven by its immense profitability, or if it also had significant religious or cultural underpinnings, with sugar playing a role in festive occasions and symbolic offerings. Was it simply about making a buck, or was there a deeper, sweeter connection to the fabric of their society? The truth, as always, is probably a complex blend of all of the above, much like a perfectly layered baklava, each stratum contributing to the overall deliciousness. From the Middle East, sugar continued its westward journey, carried by Arab merchants and conquerors. When the Umayyad Caliphate established itself in Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, in the 8th century, sugar cane came with them. The warm climate and the Arabs' mastery of irrigation made Spain a new hub for sugar production. This was significant because it brought sugar production, not just trade, directly onto the European continent. It was still a luxury, reserved for the wealthy and the sick. But it was there, tantalizingly close to a continent that largely still relied on honey for its sweetness. You can almost hear the European bees breathing a collective sigh of relief, thinking, "Finally, a break. My little knees were getting sore." The impact of this Arab golden age of sugar cannot be overstated. They didn't just pass on the baton. They transformed it into a gilded scepter. They refined the product, expanded its reach, and integrated it into their economy, medicine, and cuisine in ways that laid the groundwork for its eventual global domination. Before the European powers got truly involved, the Arab world had already written a significant and surprisingly sweet chapter in sugar's history. You see, this wasn't just about a plant. It was about knowledge, innovation, and the relentless human desire for something that simply makes life a little bit better, even if it's just for a moment. They understood the power of a sweet escape, a concept we still cling to today when we reach for that chocolate bar after a long, hard day. The only difference is they had to work a lot harder for it, and probably fight off more bandits. You trudge through the arid, sun-baked lands of what they call the Holy Land, your mail coif heavy, the sun a relentless hammer on your helmet. The air, thick with the scent of unfamiliar spices and the distant murmur of a language you don't quite understand, presses in on you. Your boots kick up ancient dust, each step a testament to a journey far longer and more arduous than any pilgrimage pamphlet ever described. You're tired, famished, and frankly, a bit bewildered by this whole endeavor. Your mind drifts back to the sour apples and bland porridge of your distant European home, a culinary landscape as gray as the winter sky. And just to spice things up a bit, not that you need more spice, considering the local cuisine. If you think that's bad, just remember, hygiene in the 11th century was, let's just say, more of a suggestion than a rule. Chances are you probably won't survive this expedition anyway, between the dysentery, the actual battles, and the distinct lack of proper dental care. But hey, at least you're about to stumble upon something truly incredible, something that will change the very fabric of European kitchens, and ultimately your waistline. You see, while you've been busy dreaming of glorified pilgrimages and reclaiming holy sites, the locals here, the very people you're disagreeing with, have been living a life of understated culinary luxury. Remember how the Arab world, with its dazzling intellect and sprawling empire, had taken sugar, that precious secret from ancient India and Persia, and turned it into an art form. They didn't just grow it. They refined it, crystallized it, turned it into syrups and confectionaries that would make your grandmother's honey cakes look like. Well, just a bit sad, really. As you push deeper into the territories, past besieged cities and through fertile valleys, you begin to notice something unusual. It's not just the date palms or the olive groves. You hear whispers, see glimpses of strange, tall green stalks that resemble bamboo, but thicker, greener, in fields tended with an almost scientific precision. You might dismiss it as just another foreign plant, another curiosity in this bewildering new world. But then, you encounter it. Perhaps it's in a captured supply wagon, surprisingly intact despite the skirmish. Or maybe you find yourself bartering with a local merchant. less interested in holy relics and more in basic sustenance. What you unwrap, or what's offered to you, isn't just honey, though that sweet, sticky gold has been your go-to for millennia. No, this is different. It's crystalline, sparkling, almost like crushed jewels. You tentatively taste it. And then a moment of pure, unadulterated shock. It's sweet. Incredibly, intensely sweet. A pure, clean sweetness that assaults your palate, awakening dormant taste buds you didn't even know you possessed. It melts on your tongue, leaving behind a sensation that is utterly foreign, utterly delightful. This, you discover, is sukkar. For you, a European, trained on the subtle, earthy notes of wild berries, the sharp tang of crab apples, and the occasional rich depth of honey, this is a revelation. Honey, wonderful as it is, carries the floral essence of its origins, the faint tang of beeswax. But this sukkar, its sweetness distilled, pure, and unadulterated. It's a taste that hints at exotic lands, at scientific mastery, at a level of refinement your home kitchens can barely comprehend. This is your mainstream historical fact. By the way, European crusaders, during their campaigns in the Holy Land, were among the first Western Europeans to truly encounter sugar in its refined, crystalline form. They didn't just see it. They tasted it, experienced its transformative power. And like any good souvenir seeker, they weren't about to leave without bringing some of this magical substance back home. They weren't thinking about global trade empires or dietary crises at this point, mind you. They were probably just thinking, wow, this tastes better than anything my cook back home could ever dream up. And perhaps, if I can get some of this, maybe I won't have to eat another bland turnip for the rest of my life. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Imagine the confusion, back in Europe, when these returning crusaders started talking about this miraculous sukkar. Some, in their zeal, might have described it as a new kind of salt, but sweet. Others might have initially thought it was a precious spice, given its rarity and the way it was transported. Indeed, for centuries after its introduction to Europe, sugar was primarily treated as an exotic spice or a medicine, used sparingly in apothecaries and noble kitchens, rather than the everyday commodity it would eventually become. You certainly weren't sprinkling it liberally on your breakfast porridge. If you even had breakfast porridge, which you probably didn't, because it was still 1,000 years before the invention of breakfast cereals. So no lucky charms for you, I'm afraid. The logistics of bringing it back were, shall we say, challenging. Imagine trying to transport delicate, easily soluble crystals across vast distances, through deserts, over seas, and past numerous opportunistic bandits. It was less like ordering something online, and more like attempting a high-stakes, cross-continental heist with a very fragile, very desirable payload. Each lump of sugar that made it back was a testament to sheer perseverance, or perhaps just dumb luck. This reintroduction of sugar into the European consciousness was a slow burn, not an explosion. Initially, it remained a luxury of the elite. Kings, queens, and the very wealthiest nobles were the first to indulge, using it to sweeten wines, create elaborate confections, or even as a display of wealth. Imagine a medieval feast where the highlight isn't the roasted boar, but a delicate, sugar-sculpted castle. Talk about showing off. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for crusaders adopting sugar was purely culinary delight or its perceived medicinal properties. Was it simply a delicious new taste sensation that spurred its import? Or did its crystalline form and perceived purity lead them to believe it held healing powers, a sort of medieval superfood? Perhaps it was both, a delightful medicine that also happened to make your unpleasant gruel taste like a dream. After all, if something tastes that good, it must be good for you, right? Spoiler alert. Not always. What is certain is that the Crusades, despite their complex and often violent history, served as an unwitting conduit for cultural exchange. The returning knights, soldiers, and merchants brought back more than just tales of holy lands and battles. They brought back goods, ideas, and tastes that would slowly but surely reshape the landscape of medieval Europe. Among these, few would prove as profoundly impactful or as utterly delicious as sugar. You, the weary crusader, may have started your journey seeking spiritual salvation, but you ended up discovering a sweetness that would eventually conquer the world. And you didn't even get a souvenir t-shirt. You find yourself adrift, not on the open sea of a tumultuous crusade, but in a labyrinth of watery streets where the very air shimmers with the scent of salt, spices, and something else. Something intensely, alluringly sweet. The gentle lapping of the Grand Canal against ancient stone facades is your lullaby. As gondolas, sleek and silent, glide past, laden not just with weary travelers but with unimaginable wealth. You can almost taste the dampness in the air, a cool kiss against your skin, a stark contrast to the blazing sun that beat down on battlefields. This, my friend, is Venice, the undisputed queen of the Adriatic, and she's about to become the single most important gatekeeper to Europe's newfound addiction. Sugar, remember those returning crusaders, their pockets perhaps a little lighter from battle, but their minds buzzing with exotic tastes. They brought back tailies, and more importantly, tiny, precious samples of a granulated sweetness that had, up until then, been little more than a whisper in European minds. Honey had been your go-to, your primal sweetener, but this new arrival was different. It sparkled. It dissolved. It was pure. And the Venetian merchants, with their sharp eyes and even sharper minds, saw not just a curiosity, but an empire. They saw not just a treat, but a gold mine. You see, while your average European serf was still gnawing on a turnip and wondering if they'd survive the next winter spoiler, you probably wouldn't have. The wealthy elite were ready for something new, something indulgent. Venice, with its vast mercantile fleet and its strategic position connecting east and west, was perfectly poised. Imagine her, an octopus with tentacles stretching across the Mediterranean, drawing in treasures from every corner of the known world. She wasn't just trading, she was controlling. From Alexandria and Beirut, the sugar, still largely unrefined, resembling coarse brown sand more than the white crystals you're used to flowed into Venetian warehouses. It arrived packed in reed baskets, sometimes in crude wooden barrels, guarded fiercely by merchants who understood its true value. You'd probably scoff at the dusty, lumpy stuff, thinking it looked more like something you'd use to scrub your floors than sweeten your tea. But to a medieval European, this was culinary gold. This was medicine. This was, quite literally, magic. The Venetian Doge, the elected ruler, presided over a city-state that operated like the world's first true multinational corporation. They had the ships, the capital, the networks, and crucially, the political savvy to negotiate exclusive trading rights with the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and other Eastern powers. This wasn't just about supply and demand. It was about monopoly. If you wanted sugar in Europe, you came to Venice. If you wanted to get rich selling sugar, you became a Venetian merchant, or at least you dealt with one. It was an ingenious system, turning a once obscure crop into the ultimate luxury commodity, almost overnight. You might compare it to a modern tech giant cornering the market on a revolutionary new gadget, but instead of microchips, they were dealing in sweet, sweet granules. It makes you wonder if they had a marketing department, because they certainly sold the dream. The price of sugar was astronomical, of course. It was so precious that it was often stored in apothecaries, alongside rare herbs and spices, rather than in kitchens. Doctors prescribed it to cure ailments, believing in its restorative powers. It was presented as a gift to royalty, molded into fantastical sculptures for banquets. Imagine a sugar castle, shimmering under candlelight, knowing it cost more than your entire village's annual income. These were the true status symbols of the age. Forget your fancy modern cars or designer handbags. Back then, a spoonful of sugar was the ultimate flex. And if you happened to have a whole sack, well, you were practically King Midas, but with a much better diet. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. Venice's wealth from the sugar trade, alongside spices and silks, fueled its artistic and architectural golden age, allowing the construction of magnificent palaces and churches that still stand today. The city literally sparkled with the profits of distant fields. But it wasn't just the physical structures. It was the entire Venetian way of life. The grand festivities, the intricate glasswork, the elaborate costumes, all underpinned by a thriving mercantile empire that understood the power of commodities. Now for a quirky tidbit. Venetian glassblowers, famous for their exquisite artistry, even began to create sugar-specific molds and containers. Imagine the most delicate, jewel-toned glass, crafted solely to hold this precious white dust. It wasn't just about consumption. It was about presentation, about elevating sugar from a mere foodstuff to an object of desire, a work of art in itself. Some even speculate that the early techniques for processing sugar in Venice, particularly the refining process, drew heavily on the city's experience with glass-making, both requiring precise heating and cooling, and a focus on clarity and purity. Historians still argue whether this cross-pollination of industrial knowledge was a deliberate innovation or a serendipitous development. As Venice tightened its sweet grip, the demand across Europe only intensified. From the royal courts of France to the burgeoning merchant classes of England, everyone wanted a taste. This wasn't just about making food taste better. It was about prestige, power, and a new kind of pleasure that was intoxicatingly addictive. The seeds of a global obsession, fueled by Venetian ambition, were firmly planted. And as the sugar flowed west, the whispers of its true cost, of the distant fields and the labor that wrung sweetness from the earth, were still too faint to be heard over the clamor of Venetian gold. Remember that complex network Venice had built, becoming the formidable gatekeeper to this sweet, exotic new world. Well, as sugar trickled into Europe through those Venetian channels, it wasn't exactly showing up in your local bakery. Oh no, you're not just holding a crystalline lump. You're holding history distilled and solidified. Imagine, for a moment, you're standing in a dimly lit, richly appointed medieval chamber. The air is heavy with the scent of beeswax candles and roasted meats. Your host, a lord of considerable means, gestures towards a small, ornate silver box at the head of the table. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, are a few precious, glistening white lumps. This, my friend, is sugar. It's not a common condiment. It's a jewel, a trophy, a whisper of exotic lands you can only dream of. If you tried to casually dump this into your morning gruel, you'd probably be disowned by your family, branded a spendthrift, and exiled to a remote, turnip-eating village where sweetness meant a particularly ripe apple. And frankly, you probably wouldn't survive the ensuing economic fallout your extravagance would cause. This isn't just a sweetener. It's practically liquid gold. a symbol of power so potent it almost hums with its own quiet authority. To truly grasp its allure, you have to understand the prevailing palate of medieval Europe. Life was, by modern standards, a rather bland affair, gastronomically speaking. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were already highly prized. But sugar offered a completely different dimension of sweetness. A pure, intense delight that honey, the traditional sweetener, simply couldn't match in its refined form. So when it arrived, often in small, irregular cones or crystalline chunks, it wasn't just an ingredient, it was an event. Imagine yourself at a lavish banquet hosted by a powerful duke. The tables groan under the weight of roasted swans, boars' heads, and platters of exotic fruits. But the true showstopper often wasn't the main course. It was the subtleties. Elaborate sugar sculptures molded into fantastical creatures, miniature castles, or even allegorical figures representing virtues or historical events. These weren't just edible decorations. They were artistic masterpieces, commissioned at enormous expense, designed to awe and impress. The very act of consuming sugar was a participation in an exclusive club, a subtle yet profound flex that screamed, "I can afford the good stuff, and you, my dear neighbor, probably can't." It wasn't about the taste, not primarily anyway. It was about the statement, the ultimate status symbol that quietly yet emphatically declared your wealth and connections to those far-off, sugar-producing lands. You were literally eating your social status. But beyond the ostentatious displays of culinary artistry, sugar played an equally fascinating, though perhaps misguided, role: medicine. For centuries, long before modern pharmacology gave us aspirin and antibiotics, sugar was widely believed to possess powerful healing properties. You'd find it not just in the kitchens of the ultra-wealthy, but prominently displayed in the apothecaries, the pharmacies of the era. If you had a persistent cough, a nagging fever, or even something as serious as a mysterious flux, chances are a learned physician, draped in long robes and stroking his beard, would prescribe a preparation heavily laced with sugar. They believed it could purify the blood, strengthen the body, soothe inflamed humors, and even, in the most desperate cases, ward off the dreaded plague. A belief that, let's just say, didn't exactly pan out for most unfortunate souls. If it did, we'd all be rocking sugar cubes as face masks right now, wouldn't we? It was often combined with other exotic spices, rare herbs, and sometimes even ground pearls or precious stones, creating concoctions that were as expensive as they were exotic. Think of it, a spoonful of sugar, perhaps with a pinch of cinnamon and a dash of ground amethyst, presented as a miraculous cure. Compared to many other medieval remedies, which often involved less palatable ingredients like animal entrails or dubious botanical poultices. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from way back when? Yeah, this was definitely an upgrade, at least in taste. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact that underscores sugar's immense value. During the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, sugar was so astronomically expensive that it was often treated like a valuable commodity and kept under lock and key, alongside other precious items like jewels, gold plate, and rare manuscripts. A single pound of refined sugar could command a price equivalent to several days' wages for a skilled laborer, or even more for a less fortunate soul. It was genuinely a luxury item, accessible only to royalty, the highest echelons of the nobility, and the extremely wealthy merchant class who could afford Venice's exorbitant prices and the long, perilous journey across the Mediterranean. Its rarity made it almost sacred. Now for a quirky tidbit that highlights sugar's pervasive, if sometimes misguided, role. There's evidence, albeit somewhat fringe, that some medieval European dentists, probably the kind you'd politely decline to visit, even if your tooth was throbbing, would actually use sugar as a mild antiseptic or a rudimentary pain reliever during dental procedures. Imagine you're squirming in agony, a primitive drill whirring, or perhaps just a pair of rusty pliers, and the dentist is spooning what little precious sugar they have into your mouth, hoping for the best. It probably tasted better than the raw agony, but the long-term effects on your already troubled teeth were, well, let's just say sugar wasn't exactly a fluoride substitute back then. It's a bit like giving a Band-Aid to someone with a broken leg, well-intentioned, perhaps, but ultimately missing the point entirely when it came to oral hygiene. You can almost hear the cavities cheering. This duality of sugar, as a status symbol, and as a perceived panacea, leads us to an open scholarly debate that continues to intrigue historians. Historians still argue whether the initial European embrace of sugar as medicine was primarily due to a genuine, albeit often superstitious, belief in its curative powers, or if its immense cost and exotic, mysterious origin simply made it seem more potent and desirable to a population, accustomed to believing that expensive things must be effective. Was it truly seen as a miraculous panacea, a tangible link to divine healing? Or was it another subtle, ingenious way for the wealthy to demonstrate their superior access to rare and exotic goods, even in the most personal and vulnerable realm of health? The lines between luxury, status, and perceived efficacy were often deeply blurred, making it difficult to fully disentangle the motivations behind its widespread adoption in medieval apothecaries. Was it science, or simply incredibly effective marketing centuries before advertising agencies even existed? This new kind of sweetness, so different from the earthy notes of honey, began its slow, deliberate infiltration into the European diet, first as a medicine, then as a garnish, and finally, over centuries, as a staple. You see, honey, while sweet, carries distinct floral or earthy undertones, a flavor profile that speaks of bees and meadows. Sugar, in its refined form, offered a clean, almost pure burst of sweetness, a stark contrast that was both novel and intoxicating. It allowed for new culinary possibilities, creating confections that were previously unimaginable. While it started its journey in the apothecary's jar, its inherent deliciousness and the sheer delight it offered meant it was always destined for more than just treating ailments. It was a taste of paradise, a tantalizing hint of luxury that slowly, inevitably, began to creep from the medicinal cabinet onto the dinner table, albeit only the most exclusive ones. You can imagine the conversations. "Oh, you poor thing, you have a cough. Here, try this sugar syrup. But don't tell anyone, it's dreadfully expensive and purely for medicinal purposes, of course." Imagine the vast, undulating expanse of the Atlantic. You're not on a cruise ship, mind you. No all-you-can-eat buffets here, no shuffleboard tournaments. You're crammed onto a wooden vessel, creaking and groaning with every swell, the scent of salt and desperation mingling in the close air. Below deck, the rhythmic sloshing of bilge water is your lullaby, and the company is, well, let's just say personal space is a concept centuries away from being invented. This is the age of exploration, and you're riding shotgun with history itself. Remember how sugar was this exotic, precious commodity, filtering through Venice like liquid gold, reserved for the wealthiest palates and the most desperate medical ailments. Well, change is on the horizon, a seismic shift that's about to democratize sweetness in a way no one could have possibly imagined. This isn't just about a new trade route. It's about an entirely new world opening up, both literally and figuratively, to a plant that will fundamentally reshape human societies, economies, and even the very notion of what it means to be sweet. You're sailing west, following the ambitions of a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus. It's 1493, his second voyage across the seemingly endless blue, and he's not just bringing settlers and dreams of gold. Oh no. Tucked away in the hold, perhaps in sturdy wooden crates or carefully wrapped bundles, are cuttings of sugar cane. Yes, the very plant that started its journey in New Guinea, then spread through India, Persia, and the Arab world, finally reaching European hands, is now making its most audacious leap yet. Columbus personally brings these cuttings to Hispaniola, what we know today as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It's a seemingly small act, a handful of plant material carried across an ocean, but it's a moment that will echo through centuries, dramatically altering global economics, diets, and human lives on an unprecedented scale. When you think about it, Columbus was basically the world's first agricultural venture capitalist, just without the PowerPoint presentations and the ergonomic office chairs. And let's be real, if you were on that boat, enduring weeks of scurvy, questionable rations, and the constant threat of storms, you probably wouldn't survive the voyage, let alone the mosquito-ridden, disease-infested paradise that awaited. Good thing you're just listening to me tell the tale from the comfort of your warm bed, right? What's interesting is that, while Columbus is credited with the introduction, it wasn't an immediate success story for sugar. The early attempts to cultivate it in Hispaniola were, frankly, a bit of a flop. The native Taino populations, ravaged by European diseases and forced labor, weren't exactly enthusiastic about planting a crop they'd never seen before, for masters who treated them so brutally. Imagine trying to explain to a 15th century Taino farmer, who's never seen a wheel, that he's now supposed to spend his days cultivating a foreign grass, so some pale guy across the ocean can put it in his coffee. You'd get a lot of blank stares, and probably a few well-aimed spears. It took several years, and the arrival of more experienced sugar cultivators, often from the Canary Islands, for the industry to truly take root. Some records even suggest that the very first cane planted by Columbus died out, requiring fresh imports later. It wasn't just a simple planting and boom, sugar empire. It was a struggle against unfamiliar soils, harsh climates, and a devastating human cost. Historians still argue whether Columbus fully grasped the immense economic potential of sugar cane in the New World at the time of its introduction, or if it was just another experimental crop alongside spices and other European staples. Was he a visionary agriculturalist, or just a hopeful opportunist throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck? The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the murky middle, obscured by the passage of time and the self-aggrandizing narratives of explorers. But the seed, quite literally, had been planted. The Caribbean islands, with their fertile volcanic soil, consistent rainfall, and year-round warmth, proved to be an almost perfect environment for sugar cane to thrive once the initial hurdles were overcome. This realization that these distant lands could become giant, outdoor sugar factories was like striking black gold for European powers. Suddenly, there was the potential for sugar, that once rare medicinal luxury item, to be produced on an industrial scale, to flood European markets and become accessible to the masses. You can almost hear the gears of nascent capitalism grinding into motion, smelling the metallic tang of ambition mixed with the sweet, sticky scent of molasses. But this sweet dream had an incredibly bitter reality. The labor required to cultivate, harvest, and process sugar cane was immense, brutal, and ceaseless. The indigenous populations, as we touched on, were rapidly decimated by disease and the harsh conditions of forced labor, a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. This created a colossal labor vacuum, a problem that would be solved with an even more horrific solution: the transatlantic slave trade. The insatiable demand for sugar, fueled by its newfound availability and desirability in Europe, became the primary driver for one of humanity's darkest chapters. Imagine the sheer scale of the operation. You're not just planting a few rows of cane for your kitchen. No, you're overseeing vast plantations stretching as far as the eye can see, fields of green stalks swaying in the tropical breeze, each one representing hours of backbreaking toil under a relentless sun. The processing, too, was incredibly dangerous. You're dealing with boiling vats of molasses, sharp machetes, and the constant threat of accidents in the mills, limbs lost, lives extinguished, all in the name of sweetness. It's a far cry from the delicate alchemy of Persian sugar-making or the careful, contained trade of Venetian merchants. This is industry, raw and unfeeling, powered by human suffering on a monumental scale. I bet the original marketing slogan for New World Sugar was something like, "It's so sweet, you'll forget about the scurvy and forced labor. Disclaimer, scurvy and forced labor still apply." The shift was profound. Before Columbus, sugar was a niche product, a special treat, a status symbol that whispered of exotic lands and immense wealth. After Columbus and the subsequent establishment of vast sugar plantations, it became an engine of empire. Spain, then Portugal, England, France, and Holland all scrambled to secure their own sugar colonies. Realizing that control over sugar production meant immense wealth and unprecedented power back home. The scramble for these tropical islands, for this sweet gold, was intense, leading to wars, piracy, and a constant reshuffling of colonial power. Every European monarch seemed to realize that the key to their kingdom's prosperity might just lie in a field of tall, green grass thousands of miles away. Think about the transformation. That once scarce, almost magical substance, a symbol of extreme wealth and status, is on the cusp of becoming commonplace. You'll soon see it in your tea, your cakes, your preserves everywhere. But the hidden cost, the silent suffering baked into every glistening crystal, is immense. It's a paradox. The more accessible and abundant sugar became, the darker and more morally compromised its production became. This is where the story of sugar really diverges, where it stops being just about a plant and its journey, and starts becoming about humanity's capacity for exploitation in pursuit of desire. The sweetness you craved, the sweetness that made honey and fruit so appealing, is now manufactured on an industrial scale, but at a price that far exceeds its monetary value. The seeds of this immense transformation, this complex, often horrifying legacy, were sown the moment those first sugar cane cuttings touched the soil of the New World. It's a moment that irrevocably linked sweetness with servitude, pleasure with pain, and opened a Pandora's box of global interconnectedness, for better and far too often for worse. Imagine, if you will, the sticky, humid embrace of a Caribbean dawn. The air hangs heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something sweet, almost cloying, that hints at untold potential. You're standing on virgin soil, where the sun beats down with a relentless, purposeful warmth, and the rain, when it comes, drenches the land with an almost biblical intensity. This isn't your temperate European backyard, oh no. This is a place of extremes, a crucible of heat and moisture, a land so fertile it practically begs for something to grow in abundance. And guess what answered the call? Our old friend, sugarcane. If you were an early European settler here, trying to make a fortune, let's just say your chances of seeing old age were about as slim as finding a comfortable pair of shoes after a week in the jungle. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least you'll have a good story for the mosquitoes. This new world, remember that pivotal moment when Columbus first brought cane over? Well, it wasn't just a casual planting in a backyard garden anymore. This was a land crying out for industrial-scale monoculture, a place where sugar cane didn't just grow. It thrived, pushing up tall and green with an almost aggressive vitality. The climate was a perfect storm in the best possible way for this specific crop. Constant warmth, abundant rainfall, and virgin soils that had never known the demands of European agriculture. It was as if the very land itself had been waiting patiently for its sweet destiny to arrive. You can almost hear it whispering, "Finally, someone gets me." The earliest attempts at cultivation were, shall we say, a learning curve. Europeans, used to their relatively small-scale farming back home, were suddenly faced with vast, untamed wilderness. They tried to replicate their familiar methods, but the sheer scale of the land and the demanding nature of sugar processing quickly showed them that something new was required. This wasn't just farming. This was manufacturing, demanding constant attention, immense labor, and a relentless drive for efficiency. The land needed clearing. The cane needed planting, harvesting, transporting, crushing, boiling, purifying. It was an endless cycle, each step heavy with physical exertion. Initially, efforts were made to utilize indigenous labor. You can imagine the scene. European settlers, perhaps still dreaming of the feudal systems they left behind, trying to compel local populations to perform the back-breaking, repetitive work of a sugar plantation. But the indigenous peoples of the Americas, tragically, were decimated by European diseases against which they had no immunity. And those who survived often resisted, understandably, being enslaved on their own land. They knew the terrain, they could melt into the vastness of the continent, and their numbers rapidly dwindled. This created a profound problem for the aspiring sugar barons, an insatiable demand for labor with a rapidly shrinking supply. And here's where the truly dark chapter of sugar's history swings wide open. The solution, in the eyes of the burgeoning colonial powers, was to look elsewhere, specifically across the Atlantic to Africa. The transatlantic slave trade, a horror of unimaginable scale, was rapidly accelerated and profoundly shaped by the voracious appetite for sugar. This isn't just a historical footnote, it's the mainstream, undeniable fact. The birth of vast sugar plantations in the New World directly fueled, and was fueled by, the forced migration of millions of enslaved Africans. You could say sugar had a sweet tooth for human suffering, and it got its fill. Imagine the ships, packed beyond capacity, crossing the vast ocean. Imagine the terror, the indignity, the sheer brutality of the journey. And then, the arrival in a new, unfamiliar land, where your life became a relentless cycle of toil under the tropical sun. The plantations themselves were meticulously designed machines for production. Not quaint little farms, but vast, sprawling industrial complexes, often employing hundreds, sometimes thousands, of enslaved individuals. Fields of cane stretched as far as the eye could see, a green sea swaying in the breeze, deceptively beautiful for the misery it represented. The daily routine was brutal. From dawn until dusk, often longer, you would be toiling in the fields, cutting the cane with sharp machetes, gathering it, loading it onto carts. The climate, so perfect for sugar, was unforgiving for human labor. The relentless heat, the humidity, the ever-present threat of disease, the constant surveillance, and the ever-present whip of the overseer. And then the processing. The crushing mills, powered by oxen, water, or even windmills, would grind the cane, extracting its sweet juice. This juice, then, would be boiled down in series of massive copper kettles, transforming from a thin liquid into thick, bubbling syrup, and finally, into crystalline sugar. This boiling housework was incredibly dangerous, with scalding hot vats, steam, and the constant risk of falling in or being horribly burned. It wasn't a job for the faint of heart, or really, for anyone who had a choice. Historians still argue whether the sugar plantation system invented, or merely perfected, the unique brand of brutal, industrial-scale chattel slavery that defined the New World. Was it a direct evolution from existing forms of slavery? Or did the unique demands of sugar cultivation create a new, even more dehumanizing model? Regardless of the precise lineage, what emerged was a system designed to extract maximum profit through maximum exploitation. The quirky tidbit here is how quickly these plantations became self-sufficient, almost like small, brutal, self-contained kingdoms. They had their own mills, their own housing or lack thereof, their own social hierarchy, and their own rigid rules, all centered around the singular goal of producing as much sugar as possible, as cheaply as possible. The concept of efficiency was redefined at an horrific human cost. The wealth generated by these vast sugar plantations was staggering. It flowed back to Europe, enriching merchants, funding wars, bolstering empires, and creating a new class of powerful, incredibly wealthy individuals. This sweet commodity, once a rare luxury, was now on its way to becoming a staple, a mass-produced item that would transform European diets and economies forever. But you, down there in the fields, feeling the ache in your back and the burning sun on your skin, you knew the true cost of that sweetness. You were living, or barely living, the very dawn of a system built on sugar, sweat, and profound suffering. And this was only the beginning of its global reach. Exploding sweet demand. Sugar became increasingly affordable, driving its widespread demand. You're standing in a bustling London market, perhaps, or a burgeoning Amsterdam warehouse, and the air around you, once thick with the scent of spices and salt-cured fish, is now undeniably, irresistibly sweet. It clings to your nostrils, a heady perfume of molasses and refined crystals. Everywhere you look, baskets overflow with glistening white mounds, barrels stacked high with brown, sticky blocks. This isn't the rare, precious commodity you might remember from Venice, guarded behind velvet ropes. Oh no, this is sugar, and it's everywhere. You can almost taste the future, a future where your teeth will ache just looking at a bakery window. And speaking of aching, if you lived back then, without modern dentistry or antibiotics, a simple toothache could turn into a full-blown infection that, let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive. So chew carefully on that sugary pastry. The shift is palpable. Just a few short decades ago, if you even saw sugar, it was likely dusted sparingly over some lord's exotic fruit or dissolving grudgingly in a medicinal concoction. A luxury, a status symbol, even a supposed cure-all. Remember that time you imagined it was a rare, expensive status symbol and perceived medicine? Well, those days are fading faster than a sugar cube in hot tea. Thanks to the relentless expansion of those New World cane plantations, we just discussed vast, sun-drenched fields stretching as far as the eye could see across the Caribbean and parts of South America. The supply lines are positively bursting. The sheer scale of cultivation, coupled with increasingly efficient, albeit brutal, processing methods, means that what was once a princely indulgence is now trickling down, bit by glorious bit, into the hands of the merchant class, the skilled artisans, and even, gasp, the common folk. It's not just about more sugar, it's about cheaper sugar. The economics are brutal in their simplicity. More supply, relatively stable demand, which is about to explode, mind you, drives prices down. Suddenly, sugar isn't merely a sprinkle, it's a spoonful. It's no longer just for the rich, it's for the merely comfortable. And once it hits that sweet spot of affordability, your imagination, your palate, and your very culture begin to crave it like never before. You start seeing it in the morning, stirred into your increasingly fashionable tea or coffee, transforming bitter brews into delightful, energy-boosting concoctions that help you face the day. Your afternoon break now involves a sugary biscuit, maybe a slice of sweetened cake. Dinner? Oh, there's sugar in the sauces, perhaps even glazing the meats, a culinary adventurousness that would have seemed outlandish to your great-grandparents. This newfound accessibility sparks a revolution in the kitchen. Cookbooks, once filled with savory, spice-heavy dishes, begin to feature entire chapters dedicated to puddings, tarts, jellies, and candied fruits. You're not just eating for sustenance. You're eating for pleasure, for novelty, for pure, unadulterated sweetness. Imagine the excitement, the sheer delight, as your grandmother, who might have only ever tasted honey or some wild berry jam, suddenly discovers the magic of granulated sugar. She can preserve fruits with it, creating jams and marmalades that last through the long winters, a practical benefit that quickly morphs into an expectation. It's like discovering that sunshine can be bottled. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this surge is the dramatic increase in per capita sugar consumption in Britain, often considered a bellwether for European trends. In the early 18th century, the average Briton consumed around 4 pounds of sugar per year. By the close of the century, this figure had skyrocketed to over 18 pounds. That's a truly staggering leap, a testament to how deeply sugar had embedded itself into the daily fabric of life, not just for the elite but for broad swathes of the population. It was fueled, in no small part, by the burgeoning popularity of hot beverages like tea and coffee, which practically screamed for a generous dose of the sweet stuff. And since those drinks were becoming more affordable too, it was a perfectly delicious, if somewhat addictive, feedback loop. You know, like when you discover a new binge-worthy show and suddenly realize it's 3 a.m. and you've consumed an entire season. Except you're consuming sugar instead of plot twists. But it wasn't just about taste. Sugar also became a vital component in the emerging global trade network. It was, quite literally, the engine of the age of sail, filling the holds of ships that crisscrossed the Atlantic. This isn't just a story about sweetness. It's a story about economics, about power, about the brutal machinery of colonialism. The demand for sugar spurred the demand for land, and the demand for labor often forced labor, as you'll recall from the plantation system's dawn. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. The obsession with sugar became so profound that some affluent households would commission elaborate sugar sculptures for banquets. These weren't just simple cakes. They were incredibly detailed, temporary artworks, depicting anything from mythological scenes to miniature buildings, all made entirely of sugar. Imagine the skill required, the sheer waste, and the inevitable sticky fingers after the guests had departed. It was like edible performance art, proving that when you have too much of a good thing, You eventually start making miniature versions of the Eiffel Tower out of it. Or perhaps a tiny, sugary replica of that ship you remember seeing sailing from the New World, laden with all that cane. The sheer velocity of sugar's integration into daily life, from a rare spice to an everyday staple, is remarkable. Historians still argue whether this rapid shift was primarily driven by top-down forces, such as changing trade policies and elite consumption patterns, or a more organic, bottom-up desire for affordable sweetness from the general populace. Was it simply that supply created its own demand, or was there an inherent human craving just waiting for the opportunity to be unleashed? Perhaps it was a bit of both, a perfect storm of economic forces meeting primal desires. What is clear is that once sugar got its foot in the door of European kitchens, it wasn't going anywhere. It was no longer just a luxury. It was quickly becoming a necessity, transforming diets, economies, and societies in ways that few, if any, could have predicted. You might even say it became, well, sweetly inescapable. And you, dear listener, are right in the thick of it, observing this transformation unfold, one spoonful at a time. The world, quite literally, is getting sweeter, even if some of the methods used to make it so are anything but. Slavery's bitter roots, the soaring demand for sugar fueled the brutal transatlantic slave trade. You feel the sun beat down, a relentless, humid fist pressing into your shoulders. The air hangs thick and sweet with the cloying scent of molasses, but it's a sweetness that turns your stomach, a sick perfume. Around you, the cane fields stretch to the horizon, a swaying green ocean under an impossibly blue sky. You hear the rhythmic chop of machetes, a dull, repetitive thud against the fibrous stalks, and the distant, haunting melody of a spiritual. This isn't a vacation. This isn't even a particularly good dream. This is hard, brutal work, and if you were actually here, truly living this, you probably wouldn't survive the day, let alone the week. This isn't a historical reenactment where you get to go home and tell your friends about your immersive experience. Remember how we talked about sugar's demand exploding, how it went from a rare, medicinal curiosity to something everyone, from the lowliest laborer to the grandest duke, suddenly craved. Well, that craving, that insatiable desire for sweetness, became the most powerful, darkest economic engine the world had ever seen. The New World, with its perfect climate and vast tracts of land, was an ideal candy factory, but it had one problem: a severe lack of cheap, disposable labor. The indigenous populations, decimated by European diseases and brutal exploitation, simply couldn't fill the void. Enter, or rather, forcibly dragged into the picture, millions of souls from Africa. It's a stark truth. The sweet treat in your teacup has bitter roots, drenched in unimaginable suffering. The transatlantic slave trade was a direct consequence of sugar's profitability. To grow and process sugarcane on the colossal scale now demanded, you needed vast armies of workers. And these aren't the kind of jobs where you just put out a help wanted sign. No, this was an enterprise built on human beings deemed commodities, stolen from their homes, stripped of their identities, and forced into a life of brutal, unending toil. Imagine the sheer scale of it. For centuries, across the churning, unforgiving Atlantic, ships packed with enslaved Africans made the horrific journey known as the Middle Passage. Packed so tightly they could barely breathe, lying in their own filth, ravaged by disease, starvation, and despair, millions perished before even reaching the shores of the Americas. Those who survived faced a new hell, the sugar plantation. Historians still argue whether the sheer efficiency of the cruelty on these plantations, was an inherent part of the system, or a terrifying evolution driven by pure economic incentive to squeeze every last drop of labor from human bodies. Either way, the results were devastating. You might think that the sheer physical effort of cutting cane and processing it would be the worst of it, but that's just the beginning. The process of turning cane into sugar was dangerous, back-breaking, and often fatal. Boiling houses, where the cane juice was reduced to crystals, were infernos of scalding liquids and volatile machinery. Limbs were lost, lives ended, all for the golden granules that would soon sweeten European palates. It's a bit like watching a truly terrible reality show where you know what's going to happen, but you can't quite believe how awful it gets. Except you know it was real, and it happened for centuries. The mainstream historical fact here is chillingly simple. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 10 to 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. That's enough people to populate a small country, all bought, sold, and brutalized for profit. A truly staggering number, underscoring the monstrous scale of this human tragedy. Now for a quirky, though still dark, tidbit. Despite the brutal conditions and constant surveillance, resistance was constant and varied. Beyond outright rebellions, which were often brutally suppressed, enslaved people developed incredibly nuanced forms of resistance. One subtle but powerful act was known as lying out, disappearing into the dense cane fields or surrounding wilderness for a few days, sometimes to simply recover from exhaustion, sometimes to organize, sometimes to reconnect with spiritual practices. It was a fleeting, dangerous freedom, a defiant refusal to be constantly available for work, and it drove plantation owners absolutely mad. They'd spend resources tracking down these escapees, knowing that even temporary absence chipped away at their perceived control. It was the original taking a mental health day, except with, whips and bloodhounds. The economic imperative was so strong that plantation owners developed elaborate systems of control, both physical and psychological. They understood that a unified, educated, enslaved population was a dangerous one. So, they often deliberately separated families, mixed people from different ethnic and linguistic groups, and suppressed African cultural practices. It was a deliberate strategy to break down solidarity and identity, making resistance harder. This kind of systematic dehumanization wasn't just a byproduct. It was a cornerstone of the sugar economy. You hear stories about ancient empires being ruthless, but the transatlantic slave trade perfected ruthlessness for mass production. It's almost impressive in its terrifying efficiency, if you can bring yourself to use that word. And through it all, the demand for sugar only grew. The more available it became, the more people wanted it, and the more sugar was produced, the greater the need for forced labor. It was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle, a sweet, sticky vortex that sucked millions into its maw. The profits were astronomical, funding the lavish lifestyles of European elites and providing capital for the burgeoning Industrial Revolution. In a twisted irony, the very sweetness that delighted so many also became the bitter foundation of unimaginable wealth for some, and unspeakable suffering for many more. It truly was the engine that powered a significant portion of the global economy for centuries, built on the bent backs and broken spirits of enslaved human beings. This wasn't just a footnote in history. It was a central, defining chapter for entire continents. You feel the oppressive humidity cling to your skin, thick and unyielding, a second atmosphere that never quite dissipates. The air itself seems to hum with a low, constant drone, a symphony of unseen insects, the distant rhythmic thud of the sugar mill, and the muted cries that sometimes echo across the vast green fields. You trudge barefoot through the red, sticky mud, the heavy machete feeling less like a tool and more like an extension of your own weary arm. Each swing, each cut into the dense, fibrous stalks of sugar cane is a testament to an endurance you didn't know you possessed. This isn't a leisure stroll through a botanical garden, you see. This is the very heart of the sugar empire, and let me tell you, with your modern comforts and aversion to anything more strenuous than a brisk walk to the coffee machine, you probably wouldn't survive a single shift. The sun beats down with an intensity that seems almost malicious, baking the soil, reflecting off the shiny green leaves, and turning every drop of sweat into a quickly evaporating torment. You remember the seemingly simple quest for sweetness, how we traced it from ancient honeycombs and sun-ripened fruits. Well, that primal craving, once a gentle whisper in the human spirit, has escalated into a brutal roar on these American plantations, demanding an impossible tribute in human labor and life. The very soil beneath your feet, so fertile for cane, is stained with untold suffering, a dark, molasses-like residue of human exploitation. Every sunrise on the sugar plantation begins the same. Before dawn even paints the sky in bruised purples and oranges, you are roused from a restless sleep in cramped, dilapidated quarters, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and the collective anxieties of the day ahead. You join the lines of other enslaved individuals, men, women, and even children, marching in silence to the fields. The overseer's whip, a thin, cruel whisper in the pre-dawn quiet, is never far, a constant reminder of the consequences of a slow pace or a misstep. The work is relentless. Planting new cane involves digging furrows, often shoulder-deep under the scorching sun, then carefully placing the cane cuttings, ensuring they'll sprout. Then comes the weeding, an endless battle against invasive plants that threaten to choke the young cane. But the most grueling task, the one that truly defines the sugar experience, is the harvest. Imagine standing for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, wielding that heavy machete, slicing through stalk after stalk, the razor-sharp blade requiring immense precision and strength. One slip and you could lose a finger, a hand, or worse. The cane itself, often taller than you are, is sharp-edged, leaving countless nicks and cuts on your exposed skin, inviting infection in the humid climate. And let's not forget the sheer weight of the cut cane, bundled and loaded onto carts or carried on your aching back to the mill. If you thought getting your groceries from the car was a workout, try carrying 100 pounds of freshly cut sugar cane for a mile. Once the cane reaches the mill, the brutality simply shifts gears. The grinding season, often lasting months, is an inferno of noise and danger. The massive rollers, powered by oxen, water, or even windmills, ceaselessly crush the cane, squeezing out every last drop of the precious juice. The deafening roar of the machinery, the constant clatter, makes conversation impossible, isolating you further in your toil. Hands, arms, even entire bodies could be, and often were, caught in the gears, resulting in horrific injuries, amputations, and instant death. There's a particular macabre detail. Some mills kept an axe nearby, not to fix the machinery, but to quickly sever a trapped limb to potentially save a life, albeit at an unimaginable cost. It's the kind of grim efficiency that would make even the most ruthless modern CEO pause. And then, the boiling house. Ah, the boiling house. If the fields were an oven, this is the very heart of the inferno. Imagine giant copper kettles, called coppers or teaches, filled with the cane juice, heated by roaring fires beneath. You stand over these vats, stirring the boiling, frothing liquid, skimming off impurities, enduring temperatures that would make a desert dweller wilt. The air is thick with steam, and the cloyingly sweet, inescapable smell of boiling sugar. A smell that would later become synonymous with luxury, but here signifies only suffering. The danger of falling into these vats to be scalded alive in superheated syrup was a constant, terrifying reality. Many did, succumbing to agonizing deaths. This was a place where one misstep could mean becoming part of the product itself, quite literally. Mainstream historical fact. Mortality rates on sugar plantations were astronomically high, often exceeding 50% within the first few years for newly arrived enslaved people, making them death camps by any measure, driven by the brutal system and endemic diseases like malaria and dysentery. The day doesn't end when the sun sets. Often, work continued long into the night, by the flickering light of torches, especially during the crushing season, to process the perishable cane before it spoiled. Rest was a luxury, sleep a desperate, brief escape. Food was meager, often just enough to sustain the brutal labor, lacking in nutrition, leading to widespread malnutrition and further weakening bodies already ravaged by disease and endless work. Medical care was virtually non-existent, and when it was offered, it was often rudimentary and ineffective. You remember how we talked about sugar being a medicine in early Europe. Here, it was a killer. The dehumanization went deeper than just physical torment. Families were routinely separated, torn apart at the auction block, never to see each other again. This deliberate destruction of kinship ties was a cruel tactic to prevent rebellion and maintain control. Enslaved people were considered property, chattels, to be bought, sold, mortgaged, or brutally punished at the whim of their owners or overseers. They were given new names, stripped of their cultural identities, and forced to abandon their languages and spiritual practices. Yet even in this bleak landscape, whispers of resistance, tiny acts of defiance, a slow pace, a broken tool, a pilfered cane stalk, the sharing of forbidden stories managed to survive. Flickers of humanity against an overwhelming darkness. Historians still argue whether the apparent efficiency of the plantation system, achieved through such extreme violence and control, was truly sustainable in the long run, or if the constant need for replacement labor due to high mortality rates made it inherently self-destructive. The noise, the heat, the constant ache in your muscles, the ever-present threat of the whip or the mill's gears. It's a sensory overload of misery. The sugar you might casually sprinkle into your morning coffee today has this incredibly bitter origin, forged in the crucible of unimaginable human suffering. The sweetness, you see, was only for the consumer. For those who produced it, there was only the unrelenting, unyielding bitterness of forced labor and profound despair. You stand on the bustling docks of Bristol, England, the air thick with the scent of tar, salt, and something subtly sweet, a hint of the riches yet to arrive. The creak of rigging and the shouts of stevedores form a chaotic symphony as ships, fat-bellied with cargo, prepare to embark. You can feel the hum of immense wealth, an invisible current pulling you towards the horizon. This isn't just trade, you realize. This is a meticulously engineered machine of profit, churning across the vast Atlantic. And if you were a sailor on one of these voyages, especially one of the less fortunate souls below deck, well, let's just say you probably wouldn't survive this. The odds, frankly, were terrible. Imagine the scene. Your ship, sleek and purpose-built, is crammed not with sugar, but with manufactured goods from European factories. Think cheap textiles, cotton, linen, but also gleaming muskets, polished brass basins, and an alarming quantity of rum, distilled from that very same sugar molasses you heard about. These aren't luxury items, not in the European sense, but they are highly sought-after commodities on the West African coast. You're part of the first leg of what became known as the triangular trade, a colossal system of commerce that fundamentally reshaped the global economy, and indeed, humanity itself. Your captain, a gruff man with a permanent squint from years of peering at distant horizons, checks his ledger. Every item, meticulously accounted for, represents potential profit, a cog in the grand machinery of mercantile capitalism. It's like a particularly dark, convoluted Rube Goldberg machine, where the final, delicious sugar cube comes at an unimaginable human cost. The next leg, the infamous Middle Passage, is where the system's true barbarity unravels. Your ship, once laden with European trinkets, is now packed, beyond all reasonable human limits, with enslaved Africans. You can hear the groans, feel the stifling heat, smell the despair that permeates every plank of the ship. This isn't just a cargo. It's thousands upon thousands of lives, ripped from their homes, their cultures, their very identities. Remember the exploding sweet demand we talked about? This, my friend, is its horrific consequence. The demand for sugar in Europe had become so insatiable that it created an economic vacuum that only an endless supply of cheap, exploitable labor could fill. And fill it, the merchants did. The ships were designed for maximum human capacity, not comfort or survival. Historians still argue whether the sheer scale of the Middle Passage was primarily driven by the explicit demand for sugar alone, or if it was a confluence of various colonial ventures. But there's no denying sugar's central, voracious role in escalating its brutality. Finally, the third leg. You've endured the stench and the sorrow of the Middle Passage, depositing your human cargo on the sweltering shores of the Caribbean islands or the American mainland. Now your ship is emptied, cleansed as much as possible, and ready for its true prize, sugar, mountains of it. Raw sugar, molasses, rum. It's a bounty that gleams in the tropical sun, the very essence of wealth. You watch as hogsheads, massive wooden barrels, are hoisted aboard, each one representing the sweat, blood, and broken lives of countless enslaved people. This sugar, remember, isn't just a sweetener anymore. It's a commodity that fuels European economies, drives industrialization, and defines social status. Imagine the sheer volume. Ships sailing back across the Atlantic, their holds overflowing with this sweet, crystalline gold. It's a sweet return if you're a merchant or a plantation owner, but it's a bitter, bitter one for those whose forced labor produced it. You can almost taste the bitter irony mixed with the sweetness as you picture it being unloaded in London, Paris, or Amsterdam. The scale of the wealth generated by this triangular trade was truly staggering. It wasn't just individual fortunes being made, though many a merchant prince, like those we saw in Venice, certainly got filthy rich. We're talking about national treasuries swelling, port cities flourishing, and industries booming across Europe. Think about the ancillary industries. Shipbuilding, insurance, banking, all grew exponentially on the back of this trade. The sugar economy created a vast network of credit and finance, making London, in particular, a global financial powerhouse. The profits from sugar funded everything from grand country estates to scientific endeavors, from wars to philosophical movements. It's almost comical, in a morbid sort of way, to think that the very foundation of modern capitalism, the engine of so much innovation and progress, had its roots in such an inherently brutal and exploitative system. You could say sugar was the original dirty money, long before anyone started laundering cash through shell corporations. The West Indies, particularly islands like Barbados, Jamaica, and Saint Domingue, modern-day Haiti, became known as sugar colonies. Their entire existence revolved around the production of this one commodity. These islands, though small in landmass, held immense strategic and economic importance for their European colonial masters. A small island producing vast quantities of sugar could be worth more to a European power than a large continental territory without it. This led to fierce competition and wars between European nations, France, Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands for control of these precious islands. A quirky tidbit is that in the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which ended the 7 Years' War, Britain actually opted to keep Canada, a vast, resource-rich landmass, rather than Guadeloupe, a relatively tiny sugar island. While this is often cited as a strategic shift, it highlights just how valuable even small sugar islands were considered, and how contentious their ownership could be. For a while, it was a genuine debate. The legacy of the triangular trade, and its reliance on sugar and slavery, continues to reverberate in the modern world. You can see it in the demographics of the Caribbean, in the wealth disparities between former colonial powers and their former colonies, and in the very fabric of global supply chains. The drive for cheap goods, for maximizing profit at the lowest possible human cost, is a pattern that, sadly, you can still observe today, albeit in different forms. The casual way you sprinkle sugar into your morning coffee or enjoy a sweet dessert is, for many, entirely divorced from this dark, complex history. It's easy to forget, or perhaps easier not to know, the bitter roots of so many everyday pleasures. But as you drift deeper into this narrative, you begin to understand that nothing, especially something as ubiquitous as sugar, is ever truly simple. Its sweetness is irrevocably intertwined with a history that is anything but. The system was so entrenched, so profitable, that dismantling it would take massive social, economic, and moral upheaval. And that, dear listener, is a story for another night. You stand on the grimy cobblestones of a burgeoning industrial city, the air thick with the metallic tang of machinery and the faint, sweet scent of something baking. It's the late 18th century, and the world is quite literally humming with change. Factories, once just ambitious sketches on a drawing board, now belch smoke into the sky, their endless whirring a new kind of heartbeat for the nation. Inside, you see them thousands of workers, hunched over looms, tending to steam engines, their movements precise, repetitive, almost hypnotic. They're fueled not just by ambition or the grim necessity of survival, but by something far more mundane, yet profoundly revolutionary: sugar. Your modern palate, accustomed to every conceivable sugary concoction, might not grasp the sheer impact of what's happening here. But if you were to swap places with one of these weary souls, enduring a 14-hour shift in a damp, noisy textile mill, you'd quickly understand. You, my friend, with your current energy levels and perhaps a vague awareness of your glycemic index, would probably keel over from sheer exhaustion within the first hour. These folks, however, find their sustenance in a simple yet powerful combination. A mug of heavily sweetened tea, perhaps, or a hunk of bread spread with molasses. This isn't just about making things taste good anymore. It's about survival, about powering the relentless march of progress. Think back to those early days when sugar was a rare, almost magical substance, reserved for kings and apothecaries. Remember when it was a luxury, a medicine, a status symbol that whispered tales of distant lands and immense wealth. Well, that whisper has become a roar. The very wealth generated by the brutal triangular trade, that vast network of human suffering and commodity exchange, was now being reinvested, often unwittingly, into the very engines of the Industrial Revolution. The capital amassed from the forced labor on those vast sugar plantations, the very plantations we discussed, where lives were broken for a sweet commodity, poured into new ventures. Textile mills, coal mines, ironworks. It's a bitter irony, isn't it? The dark heart of slavery helping to pump the lifeblood of industrial advancement. Sugar wasn't merely a beneficiary of this new economic order. It was an active participant in reshaping daily life. Its increasing affordability, driven by the mass production methods born of slavery and global trade, meant it trickled down from the elite's banqueting tables to the common person's humble kitchen. Tea, coffee, and even chocolate, once harsh and unpalatable to many, became not just tolerable but desirable with the addition of cheap sugar. This transformation wasn't just culinary, it was cultural. The ritual of the tea break, the sugary treat, became woven into the fabric of working-class life, providing moments of respite and a much-needed caloric boost. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. The widespread availability of inexpensive sugar, particularly in Britain, is widely credited by historians as providing a vital, easily digestible energy source for the burgeoning industrial workforce. Imagine working long hours, performing physically demanding tasks in often harsh conditions. A simple, sugary brew offered a quick burst of energy, a momentary reprieve from fatigue. It was, in many ways, the original energy drink, long before anyone thought to add neon colors and questionable chemicals. These workers weren't checking nutrition labels, believe me. They were just trying to make it through the day. But it wasn't just about raw energy. Sugar fundamentally altered diets. Previously, common people relied on grains, vegetables, and small amounts of meat. The introduction of cheap sugar meant a sudden, accessible source of calories that required little preparation. It allowed for new food combinations, new culinary habits, and perhaps less positively, an increasing reliance on refined carbohydrates. Some historians even suggest a quirky tidbit, that the sheer caloric density of sugar, even in small quantities, might have played a role in sustaining higher population densities in rapidly industrializing areas, allowing more people to survive on less varied, but calorie-rich diets. It was like finding a cheat code for sustenance in a world of scarcity. The demand for sugar wasn't just a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. It was also a driver. As more people moved into cities and factory work, they sought convenience and quick energy. The sheer volume of sugar now consumed created an enormous market, which in turn spurred further innovation in production and distribution. Shipping routes solidified, financial instruments evolved, and the global economy, already buzzing from the transatlantic trade, gained another significant flywheel. The more sugar was produced, the cheaper it became. The cheaper it became, the more people consumed it. The more people consumed it, the more their bodies adapted to its quick energy, creating a feedback loop that powered both human bodies and national economies. Historians still argue whether the increased sugar consumption was a direct cause or merely a correlative byproduct of the Industrial Revolution's demands for a cheap, readily available energy source for its workforce? Was it simply a convenient coincidence, or did sugar actively enable the long shifts and grueling labor that characterized the age of steam and steel? Regardless, their fates were inextricably linked. The dark legacy of slavery, the immense profits it generated, and the insatiable human craving for sweetness all converged to fuel a new era, one defined by unprecedented production and profound social change. It's a complicated relationship, isn't it? Like finding out your favorite band made their first album with money from an illegal pyramid scheme. It makes you think. This sugar, pulled from the soil of distant lands by forced labor, refined in noisy, smoky mills, and distributed through bustling ports, became a cornerstone of the working-class diet. It provided the quick hit, the momentary energy needed to keep the factory gears turning, the looms clattering, and the steam engines hissing. It allowed populations to grow, cities to expand, and industrial output to skyrocket. Without this relatively cheap and abundant source of calories, the sheer scale and intensity of the Industrial Revolution might have unfolded very differently, or perhaps not at all, at least not in the same dizzying pace we witnessed. The sweet substance, once a mere spice for the elite, became the invisible fuel for an entire global transformation, leaving behind a legacy of both unimaginable progress and profound human cost. The shift wasn't just in what people ate, but how they lived. The sugar revolution within diets meant that the working classes, often crammed into urban tenements, could sustain themselves without extensive home cooking, relying on cheap, processed, and often sweetened goods. This subtly altered the domestic sphere, too. With women increasingly entering the workforce, especially in textile mills, the time for elaborate meal preparation dwindled. Sugary tea and bread offered a quick, energy-rich solution, fitting perfectly into the new rhythms of factory life. It was a societal shift disguised as a simple preference for sweetness. This quiet, sweet revolution also played its part in the growth of new industries. The demand for tea and coffee to accompany the sugar spurred the growth of trading companies, shipping lines, and retail networks. Every spoonful of sugar represented a vast, interconnected global system, from the fields of the Caribbean to the teacups of Manchester. So, when you sip your sweetened beverage today, consider the immense, often unseen, forces that coalesce to make that simple pleasure possible. It's a taste of history, literally, though probably less painful than living through it. And so, as sugar became not just a luxury, but a fundamental fuel for the burgeoning industrial revolution, sweetening the tea of factory workers and powering the nascent capitalist engine, a bitter realization began to percolate through the public consciousness. You see, while you were happily sipping your sugary concoction, perhaps admiring the steam rising from the newly invented kettle, others were beginning to taste something entirely different, the overwhelming, acrid tang of injustice. This wasn't just about economic power anymore. It was about the crushing moral cost, a ledger far deeper and more damning than any financial balance sheet. Imagine, for a moment, you are standing in a bustling European port, the air thick with the scent of molasses and salt. But then a whisper starts, growing louder, turning into a murmur, then a shout. This isn't just sugar arriving, it's the product of unimaginable suffering. This isn't just trade, it's trafficking in human lives. The very sweetness on your tongue, the energy coursing through your veins from that morning tea, now feels like a direct conduit to the unimaginable brutality of the plantations. This is where the abolitionist movement, already gaining momentum, found its most potent, most visceral argument. the moral stain of sugar. You're confronted with pamphlets, broadsides plastered on walls, depicting scenes that would curdle your newfound appreciation for dessert. You see stark woodcuts of chained figures, overseers with whips, the relentless, back-breaking labor under a scorching sun. It's no longer an abstract concept. It's a direct indictment of your daily indulgence. This isn't some obscure, faraway injustice that you can scroll past on your newsfeed. It's on your breakfast table, literally melting into your morning routine. And let's be honest, if you were actually transported back to those cane fields, working from dawn till dusk, you probably wouldn't survive the first harvest. Just a little historical reality check for your cozy bed. The abolitionists, a growing chorus of moral crusaders, seized upon sugar as a symbol. It was the physical embodiment of the horrors of the slave trade. People like William Wilberforce, whose name would become synonymous with the British abolitionist movement, tirelessly campaigned in Parliament, his voice a persistent echo of the suffering across the Atlantic. But it wasn't just about political speeches. It was a grassroots movement. Women, in particular, played a pivotal role organizing boycotts. Imagine the social pressure. Your neighbor refusing to serve sugared tea, hosting unsweetened gatherings, sending a clear message that their conscience would not allow them to participate in such barbarity. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a powerful statement. The sugar boycott became a tangible act of protest. People were encouraged to abstain from West Indian sugar, which was almost exclusively produced by enslaved labor, and instead seek out sugar from India or East Indian sugar, which was presented as free-grown. Now, whether that East Indian sugar was truly free of exploitation is a more complex historical question, one that historians still debate with considerable vigor, often arguing whether the underlying motivations were purely moral or also strategically economic, given shifting colonial interests. But for the average consumer, it offered a seemingly ethical alternative. You're effectively voting with your teacup. The abolitionists were incredibly adept at PR long before the term existed. They used powerful imagery like the famous "Am I Not a Man and a Brother?" medallion depicting an enslaved man kneeling in chains. This wasn't just a quaint piece of jewelry. It was a wearable billboard for human rights. It made the invisible visible, forcing people to confront the source of their sweet pleasures. They produced harrowing testimonies, accounts from former enslaved people, which were circulated widely, bringing the grim reality of plantation life directly into European homes. It was a shock tactic, but an effective one, designed to prick the conscience of a society that had become comfortably numb to the distant cries of the oppressed. This moral awakening was further fueled by economists and philosophers who began to question the very foundations of slavery. Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, for instance, argued that free labor was ultimately more productive and economically efficient than enslaved labor. So, while you're thinking, hold on, weren't we just talking about how sugar drove the Industrial Revolution? You're witnessing a subtle but profound ideological shift. The very forces of capitalism, initially fueled by slavery, were now, in some intellectual circles, being used to argue against it. It's almost ironic, isn't it? A bit like finding out your favorite health smoothie is actually powered by a unicorn on a treadmill. The abolitionist movement gained such traction that it eventually led to legislative action. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, outlawing the transatlantic slave trade, a momentous victory that sent shockwaves across the globe. This didn't immediately abolish slavery itself, but it was a crucial first step, cutting off the supply of new enslaved people to the plantations. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from countless moral compasses across Europe, thinking, phew, problem solved. But as you might suspect, simply outlawing the trade didn't erase the existing system overnight. The taste of sugar, for many, still carried a bitter aftertaste. The fight for true emancipation, for the complete abolition of slavery, would continue for decades more. But the seed of public conscience, fertilized by the moral cost of sugar, had been firmly planted. You're stirring your morning coffee, perhaps adding that familiar spoonful of sweetness, and suddenly a cold shiver runs down your spine. Imagine, if you will, that sweet luxury vanishing overnight. No, not because of a sudden health craze or a bizarre global allergy, but because of war. You reach for the sugar bowl, but it's eerily light, a ghost of its former sweet self. The cupboard is bare. Your favorite morning ritual, the one comforting constant in a chaotic world, is suddenly a stark reminder of scarcity. Because, let's be honest, in a truly sugar-deprived world, your chances of maintaining that cheerful disposition you're so famous for, well, let's just say they'd be about as sweet as a lemon, and you probably wouldn't survive this level of culinary deprivation with your sanity intact. This isn't just a hypothetical nightmare, you see. For much of continental Europe in the early 19th century, this became a very bitter reality. The stage was set, not by a natural disaster, but by a man who saw more than just battlefields in his grand schemes. Napoleon Bonaparte, the diminutive emperor with outsized ambitions, had a particular bone to pick with Great Britain. He wasn't content with merely defeating their armies. He wanted to choke their economy, to starve the nation of shopkeepers into submission. His weapon of choice. The continental system, a large-scale embargo implemented in 1806, designed to sever all trade between Britain and continental Europe. Suddenly, those vast quantities of cane sugar, primarily supplied by Britain and its colonial holdings, evaporated from European markets. Remember the triangular trade, the immense wealth it generated, the brutal human cost. Much of that sugar, once destined for your morning tea or the confectioner's delight in Paris or Berlin, was now effectively locked away behind blockades. The price of what little cane sugar remained skyrocketed, making it once again a luxury only for the very wealthy, a cruel irony after its long march towards affordability. This sudden and profound disruption of the sugar supply was the mainstream historical fact that spurred a desperate hunt for an alternative. Europe needed its sweetness back, and fast. Now, it wasn't as though no one had ever considered other sources of sugar. Decades earlier, in 1747, a German chemist named Andreas Marggraf had isolated sugar crystals from beetroots. He even presented his findings to the Prussian Academy of Sciences, proving that this humble root, more commonly associated with borscht or cattle feed, held the secret to replicating the sweetness of distant sugar cane. But it remained largely an academic curiosity, a quirky or fringe tidbit of scientific exploration. Because why bother when cane sugar flowed so freely and cheaply from the colonies? However, Marggraf's student, Franz Achard, picked up the torch. He continued the research, patiently experimenting with different beet varieties, working to improve the extraction methods. In 1801, Achard opened the very first beet sugar factory in Cunern, Prussia. It was a modest affair, certainly not threatening the vast cane plantations of the Caribbean, but it was a crucial proof of concept. He even sent samples of his beet sugar to Napoleon himself. And Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, immediately recognized the strategic potential. This wasn't just about satisfying a craving. This was about economic independence, about thumbing his nose at the British blockade. Napoleon wasn't one to simply suggest. He commanded. He threw the full weight of the French state behind the nascent beet sugar industry. Imperial decrees were issued, mandating the cultivation of sugar beets. Scientific institutes were established to research better methods of extraction. Financial incentives were offered to farmers who grew beets and entrepreneurs who built factories. It was a rapid, government-driven industrial revolution in miniature, all focused on a single root vegetable. Imagine the pressure, the frantic innovation, as scientists and engineers scrambled to scale up a process that had, until then, been little more than a laboratory experiment. It's almost comical, isn't it? The fate of empires hinging on a humble root vegetable forced to become a substitute for a tropical grass. One might even say it was a sweet revenge on the British, delivered by a humble root. The early beet sugar wasn't without its challenges. The taste was often described as slightly earthy, perhaps a little rough around the edges compared to the refined sweetness of cane sugar. The extraction process was less efficient, requiring huge quantities of beets to produce a relatively small amount of sugar. You couldn't just hack at a beet with a machete like you could with cane. It required more sophisticated crushing, boiling, and crystallizing techniques. Yet, the demand was so desperate that people embraced it. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and in this case, it was also the mother of a rapidly growing industry. Factories, often converted from other uses, sprang up across France and its allied territories. As the years of the blockade wore on, beet sugar production ramped up. By 1813, France alone had several hundred beet sugar factories. This shift represented a profound change in the global sugar landscape. No longer would Europe be entirely reliant on imports from distant, often slave-dependent, colonies. This new source of sweetness was homegrown, a product of European soil and ingenuity. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's true genius lay in his military strategy or his ability to spot an economic opportunity like the beet sugar industry. Was it a stroke of foresight, a pragmatic response to immediate crisis, or a desperate gamble that just happened to pay off in the long run? Regardless, the impact was undeniable. When the Napoleonic Wars finally concluded and the blockades lifted, cane sugar once again flooded the markets. Many of the fledgling beet sugar factories initially struggled to compete with the cheaper, well-established cane sugar industry. But the seed had been planted, quite literally. The knowledge, the technology, and the appetite for domestic sugar production had taken root. Beet sugar wouldn't disappear. Instead, it would slowly but steadily gain ground. Driven by continued technological improvements, better agricultural practices, and strategic government support in various European nations. It offered a buffer against political instability, a homegrown alternative that could one day rival its tropical cousin. And as the abolitionist movement gained strength, remember that powerful argument against the moral cost of sugar. Beet sugar, produced without the direct taint of slavery, presented an ethically appealing alternative, even if its economic viability was still a work in progress. The humble beet, once overlooked, had become a symbol of resilience, innovation, and a quiet revolution in the world's sweetest commodity. Global sugar rush. Sugar became a worldwide commodity, dramatically changing diets everywhere. You feel it, don't you? That subtle hum, that low thrumming vibration in the very air around you. It's not a sound you can pinpoint with your ears, but rather a sensation, a systemic shift rippling outwards from every kitchen, every pantry, every tea time ritual across the globe. Imagine standing on a vast, flat plain, watching a river swell into a mighty flood, not with water, but with sweetness. This isn't just a trickle anymore, not a distant, exotic spice for the elite, or even a simple, delightful treat. No, this is a deluge. Sugar, once a whispered luxury, is now a roar, a pervasive, inescapable presence woven into the very fabric of daily life. You reach for that morning pastry, the subtle glaze catching the light. You stir that spoonful into your coffee, watching it dissolve, transforming bitterness into comfort. You offer a child a brightly wrapped candy, and see their eyes light up with pure, unadulterated joy. It's everywhere. In the bread, the sauces, the drinks. It's in places you'd never even suspect, lurking in the shadows of savory dishes, a hidden architect of flavor. This isn't merely a preference. It's a profound, almost evolutionary shift in human dietary habits. A collective, unconscious embrace of a crystalline substance that, frankly, our bodies were never truly designed to handle in such quantities. You, my friend, probably wouldn't survive a single day if you had to process the sheer volume of sugar consumed globally today with the metabolic machinery of someone from, say, the 14th century. Your pancreas would stage a walkout faster than you can say, insulin spike. The Industrial Revolution, which sugar had so subtly helped fuel, now repaid the favor by creating the infrastructure for sugar's true global conquest. Factories churned out refined sugar at unprecedented rates, and the advent of rapid transportation, from steamships to railways, ensured it could reach even the most remote corners of the world. No longer was sugar a commodity tied directly to slave labor. Thanks to the rise of beet sugar and the gradual, though painfully slow, triumph of abolitionist movements. Now it was a product of industrial efficiency, a symbol of progress, a democratized delight. Mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, the average per capita consumption of sugar in many Western nations had increased tenfold compared to just a century prior, moving from an occasional indulgence to a daily staple. But it wasn't just how much we ate, it was how we ate it. Sugar, no longer solely a sweetener, became an ingredient, a foundational element in new culinary creations. Think of all those beloved desserts, pastries, and confectionery that are now integral to our cultural identities. Many of them are direct descendants of this sugar boom. Here's a quirky tidbit. During the height of the sugar rush, some early food scientists and public health advocates actually pushed for sugar as a vital, readily available source of energy for the working classes, even promoting it as a healthful substitute for fats, which were then viewed with more suspicion. Imagine that, a dietary villain once hailed as a hero. It highlights the constantly shifting sands of nutritional understanding, doesn't it? As sugar became cheaper and more accessible, it transcended social strata. The wealthy still enjoyed elaborate sugared confections, but now the working poor could afford a lump or two for their tea, or a sugary bun to tide them over during a long day of labor. This wasn't just about taste. It was about calories, energy, and a fleeting moment of affordable pleasure in often harsh lives. Historians still argue whether this widespread availability of cheap sugar truly improved the overall nutrition of the general populace, or if it merely displaced more nutrient-dense foods, leading to what some call empty calories on a mass scale. While it undeniably provided readily available energy, It also contributed to the rise of new dietary challenges, a legacy we are still grappling with today. The shift was profound, irreversible. You can trace its impact in dental records, in patterns of disease, and even in the very architecture of our cities, with confectioners and bakeries blossoming on every corner. From being a rare medicinal curio, sugar had transformed into a global, ubiquitous commodity, forever altering the landscape of human consumption and our relationship with sweetness. Health's unsweet truth. Modern science revealed sugar's detrimental effects on public health. You wake, not to the gentle chirping of morning birds, but to the dull ache behind your eyes, a familiar throb that whispers of last night's sugary indulgence. Perhaps it was that extra scoop of ice cream, or the soda you swore would just be one sip. You feel the sluggishness in your limbs, the slight film on your teeth, the almost imperceptible hum of your body battling against the saccharine onslaught. You push yourself upright, stretching, and for a fleeting moment, you wonder if this constant struggle against the pervasive sweetness in your diet is even worth it. And honestly, it's probably not. You probably won't survive this, not in the long run, if you keep up with the amount of hidden sugar lurking in everything from your morning cereal to your supposedly savory snack crackers. Remember that era not so long ago when sugar was the global commodity, rushing across continents, changing diets everywhere. You embraced it, we all did. It was the taste of progress, of luxury made affordable, a universal delight that permeated every corner of your culinary world. From the delicate icing on a wedding cake to the simple stir of a teaspoon into your morning tea, sugar was omnipresent, celebrated, and largely unquestioned. For centuries, it was seen as a source of quick energy, a comforting treat, even a medicine, remember. We talked about its early days as a rare, expensive status symbol, believed to ward off various ailments. Ah, how innocent we were, how sweetly naive. But as the 20th century dawned and progressed, a subtle shift began. The scientific gaze, ever curious and increasingly precise, turned its attention to the very substances that fueled your daily life. It poked, it prodded, it analyzed. And what it began to uncover about your beloved sugar was, well, let's just say it wasn't quite the sweet fairy tale you'd been living. The narrative started to fray around the edges, like an old sugar sack left in the rain. The mainstream historical fact here is glaring. The mid to late 20th century saw a dramatic rise in chronic diseases, and scientists began to connect the dots, or rather, the glucose molecules. You see, while your ancestors might have encountered sugar in smaller, more natural forms, honey from a beehive, fruit from a tree, your modern diet introduced sugar in quantities and concentrations never before imagined. It was added to everything. Think about it. Bread, sauces, yogurt, even cured meats. The average person's intake skyrocketed, turning what was once a rare indulgence into a daily, often unconscious habit. The human body, evolved over millennia to handle sporadic sugar rushes from seasonal fruits, found itself overwhelmed by the constant deluge. One of the earliest and most visually striking consequences you'd notice, and perhaps you still do, was the alarming increase in dental caries cavities. Your dentist, with their perpetually concerned expression, can attest to this. Before the widespread availability of refined sugar, significant tooth decay was far less common. Ancient skulls excavated by archaeologists often show remarkably healthy teeth, a stark contrast to the dental records of your grandparents' generation, let alone your own. It's almost as if your mouth decided to stage a tiny, sugary rebellion right there on your molars. Then came the bigger, more insidious revelations. You started to hear terms like obesity epidemic, a phrase that began to echo through public health announcements in the latter half of the century. You saw the statistics climb, reflecting a populace growing heavier, often due to diets high in calorie-dense, nutrient-poor foods, with sugar playing a starring role. Your body, ever so efficient at storing excess energy, dutifully converted those extra sugar calories into fat, piling it on for a rainy day that never seemed to come. It was like your internal accountant was trying to save for retirement, but only with highly volatile, sugary stocks. Following close behind, and inextricably linked, was the surge in type 2 diabetes. This wasn't the diabetes of old, often genetic or autoimmune. This was a lifestyle-driven condition where your body's cells, constantly bombarded by high levels of glucose and insulin, simply became resistant to the hormone that regulates blood sugar. It's like shouting at someone who's wearing noise-canceling headphones. Eventually, they just stop hearing you. And your pancreas, bless its tireless heart, just kept pumping out more insulin, trying desperately to get your cells to listen, until it eventually wore itself out. You've probably seen the ads for diabetes medications, or perhaps know someone managing the condition, a stark reminder of sugar's profound systemic impact. But it didn't stop there. The research broadened, and your heart, that tireless pump in your chest, also came under scrutiny. Early dietary guidelines often demonized fat as the primary culprit for heart disease. Remember that low-fat craze of the 80s and 90s? You stocked your fridge with fat-free yogurt and low-fat cookies, thinking you were making healthy choices. Oh, sweet irony. What often replaced the fat in those products was, you guessed it, more sugar to maintain palatability. It turns out that excessive sugar intake, particularly fructose, can contribute to inflammation, high triglycerides, and other metabolic imbalances that increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. So, while you were diligently avoiding butter, you might have been unknowingly dousing your arteries in a sticky, sweet syrup. A quirky tidbit that emerged from this period of intense scrutiny involves the very subtle ways the food industry responded, or didn't. For a long time, the sugar industry funded research that downplayed sugar's role in chronic disease, instead pointing the finger at fat. You can imagine the high-stakes meetings, the scientific papers carefully crafted, the public relations campaigns designed to keep your sweet tooth, and their profits robust. It's almost like a corporate version of nothing to see here, move along, while simultaneously offering you a free sample of their new sugary beverage. Historians still argue whether the general public truly understood the extent of this historical manipulation of dietary science, or if the sweet taste simply overpowered any lingering doubts. Some suggest that the sheer ubiquity and cultural embeddedness of sugar made it incredibly difficult for people to accept its potential harm, especially when powerful industries were whispering comforting, sugary lies in their ear. You might find yourself thinking, how could something so universally enjoyed, so seemingly innocuous, be so problematic? It's a complex web, isn't it? The very nature of sugar, its ability to light up your brain's reward centers like a Christmas tree, made it incredibly addictive. You wanted more, your body craved it, and the food industry, ever responsive to your desires, and their bottom line was happy to oblige. You became, in essence, a willing participant in a grand, global experiment on human health. The implications were, and are, profound. From the rise of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease to certain types of cancer, The scientific literature continues to expand on the less-than-sweet truth about sugar. You now live in an era where nutritional labels are scrutinized, where added sugars are a recognized category, and where debates rage over sugar taxes and public health campaigns. You look at a sugary treat now, and you can almost feel the whispers of all those scientific papers, all those clinical trials, all those concerned doctors. It's a far cry from the days when sugar was simply a delightful, guilt-free indulgence, isn't it? The world has changed, and your understanding of sweetness has, perhaps reluctantly, become much more bitter. Legacy's lingering taste. The complex, often dark, legacy of sugar continues to influence society. You reach for that afternoon pick-me-up, perhaps a sugary drink, maybe a chocolate bar, and in that simple, innocent act, you're tapping into centuries of history. You're partaking in a legacy, a complex weave of sweetness and immense sorrow, joy and profound suffering, so deeply ingrained in our global tapestry that, frankly, you probably won't survive a day without interacting with it in some form. Yes, even if you're a devout keto warrior, sugar's invisible tendrils still reach you, shaping the very world you inhabit, a world where the sweet taste comes with a deeply unsweetened past. The bitter roots of the plantation system, that engine of wealth we discussed, still cast long shadows across the Caribbean and parts of the Americas. You see it in the enduring economic disparities, the struggle for development in nations whose land was once relentlessly exploited for that coveted sweetness. The grand estates that once flourished, fueled by forced labor, left behind a landscape scarred not just physically, but socially and economically. Entire societies were built upon a foundation of brutality, their very structure designed to extract and export sugar, leaving little in the way of diversified economies or equitable distribution of wealth once the demand and the system began to shift. The sheer scale of the human trafficking for sugar cultivation, millions upon millions, created demographic and cultural shifts that reverberate to this day, shaping the very identities of nations. Consider, for a moment, how the descendants of enslaved peoples in these sugar-producing regions still grapple with the lingering effects of generational trauma and systemic disadvantage. The wealth that sugar generated flowed predominantly to European powers and their colonial outposts, while the communities that produced it were systematically impoverished. It's a historical imbalance that isn't just academic. It's alive in policy debates about economic aid, trade agreements, and even cultural heritage. You might find it utterly bizarre, for example, that some of the grandest architectural achievements in European cities during the 18th and 19th centuries were often financed directly or indirectly by fortunes amassed through sugar and the transatlantic slave trade. Imagine commissioning a stately home, knowing the bricks were, metaphorically, cemented with the sweat and tears of countless unseen laborers. Makes your artisanal coffee shop seem pretty tame by comparison, doesn't it? The health crisis, too, is a direct inheritance. We spoke about modern science revealing sugar's detrimental effects, but it's more than just individual choice. The global sugar rush meant that, for generations, populations were exposed to and conditioned to crave high levels of sugar. From infancy, you are often introduced to sweetened foods, creating a palate that expects that specific hit. The rise of processed foods, often laden with cheaper forms of sugar like high-fructose corn syrup, further entrenched these dietary habits. It's a feedback loop. Demand for cheap food leads to more sugar being added, which further drives demand, and so on. You're effectively a guinea pig in a centuries-long experiment on human consumption, and it seems the results are in. We like it too much. Historians still argue whether the demand for sugar alone was the primary driver for the scale of the transatlantic slave trade, or if it was one crucial factor among many interlocking economic forces. It's a nuanced discussion, but few would dispute that sugar's insatiable global appetite provided a powerful economic incentive for the perpetuation and expansion of that horrific system. The sheer profitability meant that moral arguments often took a back seat to financial imperatives for far too long, until the abolitionist movement, fueled in part by the very moral cost of sugar, finally gained traction. It was a long, slow grind, like extracting the last drop of molasses from a barrel. Even today, you can observe the subtle cultural imprints. Think about the enduring appeal of sweet treats during celebrations, the ingrained expectation of dessert after a meal, or the comfort food status sugar-laden items hold. These aren't just random preferences. They're echoes of sugar's historical journey from luxury to everyday staple. It shifted from being a rare medicine to a common source of energy, and eventually, a widespread indulgence. The very fabric of modern cuisine, the globalized flavors that now tantalize your taste buds, would be vastly different without sugar's ubiquitous presence. It's a ghost in the machine of your daily diet, shaping what you crave without you even realizing it. The legacy isn't just about past wrongs. It's about present habits, present health, and the complex, ongoing struggle to find a healthier, more equitable relationship with this deceptively simple white crystal. It's almost as if sugar itself has developed a personality, a charming yet manipulative friend who always knows how to tempt you into making bad decisions. You find yourself now, perhaps without even realizing it, standing at a crossroads. Not a literal one, of course, but a subtle, shifting point in time where the weight of history presses gently against the choices you make every single day. Look around your kitchen, or even just picture it in your mind. That innocent-looking packet of granulated white crystals, the vibrant hues of a candy wrapper, the gleaming jar of jam on the shelf. Each one a tiny echo of every single story we've shared over these past hours. The brutal labor, the soaring fortunes, the scientific revelations, the ancient cravings that stretch back further than memory. It's all there, woven into the very fabric of something we so often consume without a second thought. And honestly, considering the sheer volume of sugar that's now ingrained in our modern diets, you probably won't survive this without at least some impact on your dental health. Just kidding, mostly. But seriously, reflecting on this surprisingly sweet, yet undeniably dark, history of sugar isn't just an academic exercise. It's a tool, a lens through which we can better navigate its pervasive role in our lives today. You see, when you understand that sugar wasn't always a ubiquitous staple, that it was once a rare, expensive luxury, a perceived medicine even. Remember those early European days when Venice was the sugar gatekeeper, doling out spoonfuls like precious gems. When you grasp how deeply it's intertwined with the abhorrent realities of the transatlantic slave trade and the brutal plantation system that emerged in the New World, and how that legacy still casts a long shadow, it changes your perception. The journey of sugar from a humble cane plant in ancient New Guinea, through India's discovery, Persia's spreading, and the Arab golden age of refinement, all the way to its explosive global demand, is a testament to human ingenuity and, tragically, human exploitation. We saw how European crusaders brought it back, how Columbus ferried it to the Americas, and how that act sparked an agricultural revolution built on human suffering. It fueled the Industrial Revolution, transformed global diets, and even spurred abolitionist movements. Mainstream historical fact: the sheer economic power of sugar in the 18th and 19th centuries was so immense that it funded empires, built grand cities, and fueled industrial growth across Europe, creating a global network of trade and dependence unlike almost any other commodity of its time. But what about the quirky bits? Did you know that in the early days of refined sugar, before it was cheap and plentiful, people would sometimes rent out fancy silver sugar tongs for special occasions just to show off their wealth, even if they couldn't afford the sugar itself? Imagine the ultimate flex was not owning the sugar, but owning the implements for it. It's almost like a tiny historical joke about keeping up with the Joneses, or in this case, the Montagues. And speaking of keeping up, historians still argue whether the widespread availability of refined sugar was the primary driver of the Industrial Revolution's workforce energy, or if it was merely a convenient, energy-dense caloric supplement for laborers. Was it the fuel that made the machines of industry hum, or just the snack that kept the operators awake? The debate continues quietly in dusty academic halls. Now, fast forward to today. You're no longer encountering sugar as a rare luxury, or a dubious medicine, or even just a component of a triangular trade route. It's everywhere. It's in your breakfast cereal, lurking in your savory sauces, sweetening your healthy yogurt, and providing the familiar comfort in your late-night treat. Modern science has unequivocally revealed sugar's detrimental effects on public health, from dental decay to metabolic disorders, a far cry from its initial perception as a healthful cure-all. This historical context allows you to view the global health crisis around sugar not as a sudden, isolated phenomenon, but as the natural, albeit tragic, culmination of centuries of escalating consumption, driven by economic forces and shifting cultural norms. Understanding this past isn't about shaming or judging. It's about empowerment. It's about recognizing that your choices, small as they may seem, are part of a much larger, ongoing narrative. It's about remembering those bitter roots, even as you occasionally enjoy the sweet fruit. It's about making peace with this complicated legacy, acknowledging the incredible human cost, and deciding how you want to interact with sugar moving forward. As the echoes of these stories begin to soften and fade into the quiet expanse of the night, allow yourself to drift. The taste of sugar, once so elusive, then so brutally acquired, now so effortlessly present, slowly recedes. Imagine the vast, whispering cane fields under a moonlit sky, the long journey across shimmering oceans, the quiet clinking of delicate tea sets in grand drawing rooms, and the soft hum of machines turning in dimly lit factories. All of it a part of sugar's intricate dance through time. There's a gentle stillness now, a quiet settling of all those facts and feelings, like dust motes descending slowly in a beam of moonlight. The complex flavors of history, bitter and sweet, blend into a soft, calming hum. You are safe, enveloped in the quiet understanding that comes from knowing. The journey through sugar's past has reached its gentle conclusion, leaving you with a richer sense of the world, and perhaps a slightly different way of looking at that next sweet moment. Let your thoughts soften, your breath deepen, and feel the peaceful embrace of the present. All the stories are told, all the insights gathered. It's time for rest, a tranquil stillness, as the world settles into its quiet, nighttime rhythm around you. Sweet dreams.